The trunk of that silver sedan hadn't moved in 40 minutes. 11-year-old Nora had counted. She'd stood in the freezing parking lot of Delwood Auto Repair, watching the car the way a wounded animal watches a trap it's already stepped in, until her legs stopped working right and her breath came out in ragged white clouds, and she couldn't think of anything else to do except walk through the one door that had light coming under it. The Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club garage. 5 words. That's all it took to stop every wrench, every engine, every conversation dead. She's in the trunk. And now 12 men who had survived Fallujah, Leavenworth, back alley beatings, and the particular cruelty of their own minds were staring at a shivering child like she'd just pulled a pin on something none of them could outrun. Underscore, 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 underscore. Hey, before we go any further, if you've never seen this channel before, welcome. Hit that like button right now, drop a comment, and tell me what city you're watching from. We've got viewers from everywhere, and I love knowing where you're dialing in. Now buckle up, because this one doesn't let go. The garage smelled like motor oil and old coffee, and the particular kind of silence that men make when they're holding themselves very still on purpose. Cade Mercer was the first one to move. He crossed the concrete floor in 4 strides. Not fast, not slow, the way a man moves when he's learned that running toward trouble only gives trouble a head start on you. He was 43 years old, built like a highway mile marker, with a jaw that hadn't been clean-shaven in a decade and eyes the color of storm clouds over flatland. There was a scar that ran from his left ear to the hinge of his jaw that he never explained to anyone, and most people had the sense not to ask. He crouched down in front of the girl so she didn't have to look up at him. That was the first thing. "Say it again," he said. "Quiet. Not soft. Quiet is different. Soft implies comfort. What Kate offered was precision. Start from the beginning. Slow." The girl, Nora, she'd get to her name in a minute, was maybe 11, maybe 12, wearing a purple coat that was too thin for a December afternoon in Millhaven, Colorado, and sneakers that were soaked through from the slush on the sidewalk outside. Her hair was wet. She'd been standing outside long enough for her hair to get wet, and she hadn't gone anywhere else. That told Cade something. She told him her name was Nora. She told him that her best friend Ellie had gotten into a silver car in the school parking lot that morning with a man Ellie had said was her dad, except Ellie had also been crying and had turned around once to look at Nora with an expression that Nora said she didn't have words for. She'd followed them on her bicycle for 6 blocks before losing them in traffic near the overpass. But she'd seen the car again 20 minutes ago in the parking lot across the street. "Silver sedan," Cade said. "Old one. There's a dent on the back right side, and a Broncos sticker on the bumper that's half peeled off." Behind Cade, someone swore under their breath. He didn't turn around to see who. "You said she's in the trunk," he said. "You saw that?" Nora's chin went up a fraction. "I heard her. I walked by the car to look at the sticker. I heard her hit the lid twice." The garage had maybe 12 men in it at various stages of mechanical work and idleness. In the 3 seconds after Nora said that, not one of them made a sound. The compressor in the corner was running, and it suddenly sounded very loud. Cade stood up. He looked at the man closest to him, Dutch, whose real name was Gerald Vanderhoven, 6'4", 300 pounds, 15 years of club membership, and an expression on his face right now like he'd just been handed a live grenade. "Parking lot across the street," Cade said. "On it," Dutch said, and was already moving toward the side door. "Don't touch the car," Cade said to his back. "I know. Shh, don't let anyone near it who doesn't need to be near it." "Cade, I know." The side door opened and a blade of December air cut through the garage, and then the door swung shut, and it was just the compressor and the fluorescent lights buzzing above them, and 12 men recalibrating. Cade looked back at Nora. She was watching him the way you watch someone defuse something. Scared to breathe, scared not to. "You did the right thing coming here," he said. It wasn't reassurance. He wasn't built for reassurance. It was just a fact, and he delivered it like one. "You sit down. Don't go anywhere." "Is she going to be okay?" He didn't answer that because he didn't make promises about things he couldn't control yet. He moved to the corner of the garage where his vice president, a man named Trace, was already on his phone, low voice, fast words, and Cade waited for him to finish. Trace was 38, lean and angular, with ink running from his collar up his throat to just below his left ear. He'd done 2 tours in the Marine Corps as an intelligence analyst and had the particular quality of stillness that men develop when they've spent years in rooms where wrong information gets people killed. He ended his call and looked at Cade. "Mason Grady," Trace said. "That's the father's name. Ellie Grady. She's 10 years old. Parents divorced 18 months ago. Father's got a supervised visitation order. He's not supposed to have unsupervised contact with the child." He paused. "I haven't called anyone official yet. Figured you'd want to know the shape of it first." Cade's jaw worked. Outside, somewhere beyond the garage walls, the wind had picked up and was moving through the bare trees along the street with a sound like distant traffic. "What do we know about Mason Grady?" "Nothing yet. 35 minutes and I'll have more." "We don't have 35 minutes." "Then we have what we have." They stood there with that for a second. "Call the mother," Cade said, "working on getting a number." "Work faster." Cade turned and scanned the garage. Some of the men had drifted toward the front windows without being asked, just a natural gravitational pull, that old instinct, threat assessment, and perimeter mapping. Others had stayed put, watching him, waiting. These were men who had survived things that didn't make good dinner conversation. 3 of them had done time. 4 of them had come back from overseas with something missing in their eyes that never fully returned. 2 of them had lost children of their own to custody battles and systems that moved like cold molasses and cared about paperwork more than people. None of them needed to be told what was at stake. The knowledge was in the room like weather. The side door banged open and Dutch filled the frame. Cars there. Silver Chevy Malibu. 09 or 10. Dent on the rear quarter panel. Broncos sticker. He stopped, looked at Cade. I put my hand on the trunk lid and said, "Hey," real quiet, and something moved in there. The temperature in the garage dropped 3 degrees. "How old is the car?" Cade said. "Old enough the trunk latch is mechanical. Old enough someone could probably get it open from the inside if they knew where to push." Dutch hesitated. "She hasn't opened it." Which meant one of 2 things. Either she couldn't, frightened past the ability to act, or physically restrained in some way. Or she didn't know she could. Either way, every second of that conversation was a second. A 10-year-old girl was breathing recycled air in a car trunk in December. "Where's Grady?" Cade said. "Bar in the corner's open. Couple cars in the lot that weren't there an hour ago." Cade's hand went to his jacket pocket and stopped there. Old reflex. He didn't carry anymore. Hadn't for 6 years, a personal rule he kept even when he regretted it. But his hand still went there sometimes when his brain shifted into a particular gear. He consciously moved it away. "Nora." The girl looked up from the folding chair someone had brought her. "The man Ellie got into the car with? You seen him before?" "Once. At Ellie's mom's apartment, at the beginning of the school year. He was outside in the parking lot and Ellie's mom got really upset and called someone." "What did he look like?" "Tall, brown hair. He had on a yellow jacket, like a work jacket, the kind with the company name on it." Trace was already writing something on his phone. "Okay," Cade said, more to himself than anyone else. He pulled on his cut, the leather vest with the iron wolf's patch on the back, a snarling wolf head above crossed wrenches, and he looked around the garage one more time. "Dutch, Polly, Beck, you're with me. Trace, you stay here with the girl and keep working the phone. Get the mother. Get me everything on Grady." And then what? That was Beck. Youngest member of the club, 26, still had the habit of asking questions the older members had learned to stop asking because the answer was always, "Figure it out." "Then we go get a little girl out of a car trunk," Cade said. Underscore, 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 underscore. The bar on the corner was called Hannigan's, and it had been there since before Cade was born. The kind of establishment that's less a drinking spot and more a geographic feature, like a rock formation or a drainage ditch. Permanent, unremarkable, slightly menacing. The sign in the window had two burned-out letters that nobody had bothered replacing in what looked like years. Inside, it smelled like spilled beer and old regret, which was its own kind of home for certain people. Cade stood outside the door for a moment. Dutch and Polly flanked him. Beck had stayed with the car. Not close, just visible, which was intentional. Presence without provocation. That was the discipline. That was the thing that separated what they were from what people assumed they were. He pushed through the door. The bar was half full for a Thursday afternoon, which meant desperate or unemployed or both. And none of the faces that turned toward the door looked particularly surprised to see three men in leather cuts walk in. Millhaven was a small city with a particular relationship to the Iron Wolves. Complicated, uneasy, built on years of incidents both good and bad. And nobody in Hannigan's on a Thursday afternoon was naive enough to think the club's presence was social. Cade found Mason Grady in 45 seconds. He was at the far end of the bar, alone, nursing something amber in a short glass, and he fit Nora's description well enough. Tall, brown hair gone lank and unwashed, wearing the yellow company jacket, a heating and cooling company logo on the chest that Cade clocked and filed away. He looked like a man who'd been falling for a long time and had recently run out of things to grab. Late 30s, maybe early 40s, but wearing every year of it hard. There was a smear of something dark on his left forearm that might have been grease or might have been something else, and Cade didn't stare at it. He sat down at the bar 2 stools away from Mason Grady, signaled to the bartender for nothing, and said without looking at the man, "She's been in that trunk for a while." Mason's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. The bar noise, pool balls, low music from a jukebox someone had feeding country songs into the void, continued around them like its own weather system. But the 2 feet of air between Cade and Mason Grady went very, very still. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mason said. His voice was steady in the way that voices get steady when a person is working extremely hard at it. "Yes, you do." Cade still wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the bar top, the worn grain of it, the ring stains from 1,000 drinks. "Silver Malibu. Parking lot across from my garage. Your daughter's been in the trunk since this morning." The man's breathing changed. Cade could hear it. "I'm going to go out there and I'm going to get her out," Cade said. "That's already decided. The only thing that isn't decided yet is how this next part goes." He finally turned and looked at Mason Grady directly, and what he saw in the man's face complicated things considerably. Because what he saw wasn't cruelty, wasn't the flat, calculated look of a predator. What Mason Grady looked like was a man who had driven off a cliff 3 miles back and was still trying to figure out how the steering wheel had failed him. Panic, desperation, the specific kind of grief that makes people do catastrophic things while believing they're doing the only possible thing. That didn't make it okay. Nothing made it okay. A 10-year-old girl was breathing stale air in a car trunk, but it changed the geometry of the problem. "She's my kid," Mason said. The words came out rough, like they'd been waiting behind something. "I know. You don't know anything. I know you're not going to solve whatever it is you're trying to solve this way," Cade said. "And I know she's cold and scared, and that's the part that's happening right now regardless of everything else." Something moved across Mason Grady's face, a crack in the plaster of whatever he'd built to hold himself together today. His hand on the glass was shaking slightly. "Don't call the cops," he said, low, raw. "That's not something I can promise you." "Please." Cade studied him for a long moment. Outside, through Hannigan's grimy front window, he could see the parking lot of the auto shop across the street, and he could see the silver Malibu, and he could see Dutch's silhouette at the corner of the building. Big, still, patient. The snow that had been threatening all day was finally beginning. First flakes, nearly invisible, catching the gray light. "Come outside with me," Cade said. "Right now. We go together, we open the trunk, we make sure she's okay. That's step 1. And then we figure out step 2. Mason stared at him. "Who are you?" "Someone who's going to make sure that little girl is all right." Cade stood up from the bar stool, slow and deliberate, and he looked down at Mason Grady, who suddenly seemed smaller than he had from across the bar. The rest of it, everything you're carrying, whatever brought you here today, that's a conversation for after. But right now you're going to get up from that stool and come outside with me. A long pause. The jukebox played something mournful about a highway. Mason Grady set his glass down carefully, like it mattered how it landed, and stood up. Underscore, 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 underscore. They were halfway across the street when Trace's call came through. Cade answered it walking, Mason a step ahead of him, Dutch falling into position behind without being signaled to. Years of practice, the wordless choreography of men who'd done difficult things together. Talk to me, Cade said. Got the mother, Trace said, and his voice was calibrated, stripped of everything except information. Rowan Grady. I reached her at her place of employment. She's a night shift CNA at Millhaven General. She's still on shift. She knows the daughter's missing. She's been calling the school and the police for 4 hours. 4 hours. Child's been out of contact since 8:45 this morning. She reported it to Millhaven PD at 9:30. They told her to call back if the child wasn't home by 3 p.m. Cade's stride didn't change, but something in his chest did. Reported at 9:30 in the morning. It was now 2:17 in the afternoon. Nearly 5 hours of a child missing in winter. A mother calling the right people and getting told to wait. The system operating exactly as advertised, which was inadequately for people who already had nothing. She's on her way here, Trace said. 20 minutes. Tell her to come to the shop, not the parking lot. Done. A pause. Cade. Mason Grady. I pulled what I could in the time I had. Lost his job 4 months ago. The heating company let him go. He's got an apartment on the east side that he's 2 months behind on. His supervised visitation order. There was a hearing last month. Rowan's attorney filed to reduce the visits. Mason didn't show up. Cade processed that. A man watching his access to his daughter being cut away while everything else fell apart around him. It didn't excuse anything, but it was the shape of a human being in free fall, and that shape mattered because it changed what came next. Thank you, Cade said and ended the call. Mason had reached the Malibu. He was standing at the back of it with his hand on the trunk lid, not moving, like he'd gotten there and suddenly run out of whatever had been fueling him. Snow was falling steadily now, the small, serious kind that means business, settling in the lines of his jacket shoulders and in his unwashed hair. Cade stopped beside him. Open it, he said. Mason closed his eyes for 1 second. His throat worked. Then he put his hand flat on the trunk release and pressed. The lid came up. Inside, curled around herself the way small bodies do when they're conserving warmth and enduring and waiting for something to change, was a 10-year-old girl with her mother's dark hair and a worn stuffed bear pressed against her chest. She blinked up at the gray December sky and the falling snow and the ring of adult faces above her, and her mouth opened, but nothing came out for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "Is my mom coming?" And Cade Mercer, who had not cried since a roadside in Kandahar province 11 years ago, had to look away for a moment at the middle distance while the snow fell, and Dutch was already reaching carefully into the trunk with his enormous hands and saying, Hey, you're all right. I got you." Ellie was shivering. Her lips had some blue to them, but she was conscious, she was breathing, and she was holding that stuffed bear like it was the only fixed point in a spinning world. Behind them, Mason Grady had sat down on the asphalt next to the car's rear bumper. Just sat down. Not running, not fighting, just done. His hands between his knees and his head bowed and his shoulders shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Dutch wrapped Ellie in his jacket. It went to her knees and lifted her out of the trunk, and she let him. And over his shoulder, she caught sight of Nora sprinting across the street from the direction of the garage, having apparently decided that Cade's instruction to stay put had a time limit on it, and when their eyes met, Ellie made a sound like something that had been wound too tight, finally releasing. Cade watched the two girls collide in the parking lot. Then he looked down at Mason Grady sitting in the snow. "Police are going to be here soon," Cade said. Mason nodded without looking up. I know. You're not going to run. It wasn't a question. Mason shook his head. Cade stood over him for another moment, the snow coming down between them, and he thought about the shape of a man who'd made the worst decision of his life because he'd run out of any other kind. He thought about what Trace had said, 2 months behind on rent, lost his job, watched his visitation rights getting taken away by a hearing he hadn't shown up to. He didn't know yet whether Mason Grady was someone worth the thought. He didn't know enough. But the girl was out of the trunk. That was what mattered right now. That was the fixed point. He pulled out his phone to call Trace back, and then he stopped, because a car had just turned into the parking lot too fast, braking hard on the slick asphalt, and the woman who came out of it before it had fully stopped was moving toward Ellie with the momentum of someone who had been suspended in terror for 5 hours and had just been cut free. Rowan Grady. She looked exactly like someone who'd been awake since before dawn, and on her feet since and had spent the last 5 hours making phone calls to people who'd told her to wait and wait and wait. She was wearing scrubs under an open coat, dark circles under her eyes, and she crossed the distance between her car and her daughter in the time it takes to exhale, and then Ellie was in her arms, and neither of them were making intelligible sounds anymore, just the inarticulate language of relief too large for words. Dutch stepped back. Polly stepped back. Beck, who had materialized at some point, stepped back. Cade stayed where he was. After a minute, Rowan lifted her face from her daughter's hair and looked around the parking lot, at the motorcycles that had gathered at the edges, at the men in leather cuts who were giving her space, at her ex-husband sitting in the snow by the bumper of his own car. The expression that crossed her face when she looked at Mason was complex enough to fill several chapters. Fury. Something older than fury. Something that might have been grief underneath. Then she looked at Cade. You found her, she said. We didn't find her, he said. Her friend did. He nodded toward Nora, who was standing close to Ellie, but had the social intelligence to leave mother and daughter to their moment. She came and got us. Rowan looked at Nora for a long moment. Then she looked at Cade again, and something in her face shifted. The police are coming, she said. Yes. I called them this morning. I know, Cade said. Trace told me. He didn't elaborate. The elaboration wasn't necessary. She already knew what 5 hours of being told to wait felt like. The sirens were audible now, still blocks away but getting closer. Mason Grady had not moved from the asphalt. The snow was sticking to his jacket now, accumulating in the folds of fabric, and he sat there with his hands between his knees and looked at his daughter, who was looking back at him over her mother's shoulder with an expression that was not hatred, not relief, but something more confusing than either of those things. Something that was probably going to take years and a lot of professional help to fully untangle. Rowan shifted Ellie's weight against her hip and turned to face her ex-husband. The distance between them was maybe 15 feet. The parking lot had gone very quiet except for the sirens and the snow. Mason, she said. Just his name. 2 syllables, everything compressed inside them. He finally looked up. What she saw in his face made her own face do something difficult. She looked away. She held Ellie tighter. The first police cruiser turned into the parking lot. Cade watched the light bars paint blue and red across the chrome of the motorcycles along the lot's edge, across the falling snow, across the faces of men who had every reason to be uncomfortable around law enforcement and were standing their ground anyway because a child had walked into their garage and asked for help, and that meant this was their situation until it resolved itself. Beck appeared at his shoulder. What do we do? We stay, Cade said. We answer questions. We tell exactly what happened. And Grady. Cade looked at Mason Grady, who was now standing shakily because the officer coming toward him had indicated he should. His hands were going out from his sides in the universal gesture of surrender. Slow, deliberate, showing empty palms. He stays too, Cade said. He watched Mason Grady get walked toward the cruiser, one officer on each side, and he thought about the yellow jacket with the company logo, and the apartment 2 months behind on rent, and a hearing he hadn't shown up to, and the particular shape of a person who'd made a catastrophic decision from inside a life that had been collapsing around him long before today. None of it made what happened okay. But there was a distinction Cade had learned, at cost, between a man who needed to be stopped and a man who needed to be stopped and then given something to do with his hands other than destroy things. He wasn't sure yet which kind Mason Grady was. He'd be watching. Behind him, he heard Rowan's voice, low and tight, asking one of the officers how long this was going to take. He heard Ellie's voice, small, exhausted, slightly muffled by her mother's coat, saying she was cold. She was really cold. Dutch was already heading back across the street toward the garage. Trace would have coffee going. There would be chairs and heat, and the specific, uncomplicated shelter of a building full of people who had decided, at some point, that they were done letting things happen to the people around them. Cade turned and followed Dutch. He was halfway across the street when Rowan called after him. He stopped, turned around. She was standing in the snow with Ellie pressed against her side, one arm around her daughter's shoulders, and she looked like someone who'd just survived something she wasn't sure she deserved to. I don't know why you helped, she said. You don't know us. Cade looked at her for a moment. She came and asked, he said. He turned back toward the garage. Behind him, the police radios crackled in the cold. The snow fell harder. And somewhere in the back seat of a cruiser, Mason Grady was beginning to understand that the day's reckoning was only just arriving, and that what happened next, for him, for Ellie, for all of them, was going to depend on things none of them could see yet, including the documents Trace had just found on Mason Grady's phone. Documents that had nothing to do with custody. Documents that changed the shape of everything. The documents on Mason Grady's phone were not his. That was the first thing Trace said when Cade walked back into the garage. And the way he said it, low, careful, the way a man announces something that's going to change the temperature of the room, made everyone within earshot stop what they were doing. The garage had become something between a command post and a waiting room. Rowan was in the back office with Ellie and Nora, the door half closed, someone having produced hot chocolate from somewhere because Dutch had that particular instinct for crisis management that expressed itself in warm beverages. Two of the younger club members, Remy and a prospect named Holt, were outside keeping a casual perimeter, which meant standing near their bikes smoking cigarettes and watching the street with the kind of studied nonchalance that announced itself as anything but. The police had taken Mason away 40 minutes ago. The snow was still falling. Cade took the phone Trace was holding out to him. It was in an evidence bag, which was going to become a problem when the detectives who'd taken Mason's statement noticed it was missing from his personal effects. But that was a secondary problem, and they'd deal with it when it arrived. He looked at the screen through the plastic. The documents were photographs. 12 of them, taken inside what looked like a storage unit or a converted warehouse space. Concrete floors, metal shelving, industrial lighting. The photographs showed crates. The crates had shipping labels on them that Cade couldn't read at this resolution. And in 4 of the 12 photographs, visible at the edges like something the photographer hadn't meant to capture, were men. 3 of them. Faces partially turned away, features indistinct in the industrial lighting, but body language unmistakable. The stance of people engaged in something that required attention and caution. When were these taken? Cade said. Metadata's been stripped, Trace said. Someone did it deliberately. But the phone logs show they came in as a text message attachment 3 weeks ago. The number they came from is disconnected now. Cade handed the phone back. He walked to the workbench along the wall and stood there for a moment with his hands flat on the surface, looking at the pegboard of tools in front of him without seeing any of it. Behind him, he could hear the garage, the hiss of the space heater, someone shifting their weight on the concrete, the muffled sound of a child's voice from the back office. Someone sent these to Mason, Cade said, and Mason put his daughter in a trunk. Those 2 things are connected, Trace said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. Cade straightened up. They are. Dutch was leaning against a support beam with his arms crossed, which on most men looks casual and on Dutch looks like a geological event in progress. So we got a guy who grabbed his own kid and ran, he said slowly. And now we're finding out he had these photos on him. Question is he the one who took them, Or is he the one who received them because someone wanted him to have them? That's the question, Trace agreed. There's another question, said a voice from across the garage, and it belonged to Beck, who was 26 and had the particular quality of young men who've been through enough to have opinions and not enough to know when to keep them to themselves. Why are we still holding his phone? That's evidence. Cops find out we have it. This whole afternoon gets a lot more complicated for the club. The garage went quiet in a particular way. Cade turned around slowly and looked at Beck. Beck met his eyes and didn't flinch, which Cade credited him for, even while it annoyed him. You're right, Cade said. And you're going to walk that phone across the street to the detective who's still processing the scene, and you're going to explain that it fell out of Grady's jacket when we got the girl out of the trunk. You got that? Is that what happened? That's what you're going to say happened. A pause. Beck looked at Trace, who gave him nothing, looked back at Cade. Okay, he said, and took the evidence bag and went. After the door closed, Dutch uncrossed his arms. He's not wrong. I know he's not wrong. We're already tangled up in this. I know that too. So what are we doing? Cade looked at him, at Trace, at the half-dozen other men arranged around the garage in various configurations of attention. These were men who had followed him into things before, not because they were obligated to. The club wasn't built on obligation. It was built on something harder to name than that. A shared understanding that had accumulated over years of small decisions about what kind of people they were going to be. They'd followed him because they trusted his read, and his read had been good more often than not. But there were things in his history that cast shadows on that trust. And right now, in the specific light of the fluorescent tubes overhead, he could see those shadows on some of their faces. I'm going to talk to Rowan, he said, and then I'm going to go see Mason Grady. He's in custody, Trace said, for now. They'll arraign him tomorrow. Charge is custodial interference, possibly endangering a child. His attorney, if he can afford one, will push for bail. Cade picked up his jacket from the workbench. Windows tight. Cade. That was Trace again, and the register of his voice had changed in the small way that meant he was about to say something he'd been holding. Those photos on the phone, the warehouse, the crates. I've seen shipping label formats like that before. Where? A pause. Fort Bragg. 2009. We were tracking gray market military surplus being moved through civilian distribution channels. He let that sit for a moment. Someone is using Mason Grady for something. Or someone was using him. The question I keep coming back to is whether he knows it. The space heater hissed. Outside, a motorcycle engine turned over and idled, probably Remy keeping warm, and the sound of it filled the silence in a way that was almost comforting, the deep familiar rumble of machinery that worked the way it was supposed to. Get me everything, Cade said. Every piece of background on Grady you can find. Employment history, military record if he has one, known associates, financial, everything. Already started, Cade nodded. He walked to the back office door and knocked twice with his knuckle, light and deliberate, the knock of a man announcing himself without demanding entry, and waited. Rowan's voice came back. Come in. Underscore, 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 underscore. Ellie had fallen asleep. She was on the old couch that had lived in the back office since before Cade took over the shop, covered with someone's club hoodie, the stuffed bear tucked under her chin, and she was breathing with the deep, surrendered quality of a body that had been frightened past its limits and had finally been given permission to shut down. Nora was sitting on the floor near the couch with her back against it, and her knees drawn up, looking at her phone but not really seeing it. Rowan was in the chair across from the desk. She'd buttoned her coat, and she was holding a paper cup of coffee with both hands, and she was watching her daughter sleep with an expression Cade had no language for, had never had language for. The kind of sustained, anguished love that parents carry around like a second skeleton inside them, invisible and load-bearing. She looked up when he came in. He sat down on the edge of the desk because there was only the one chair and he wasn't going to make her give it up. "She all right?" he said, keeping his voice low. Paramedics said mild hypothermia. Her temperature was low, but she warmed up fast. Rowan looked back at Ellie. She asked if her dad was going to jail. Cade said nothing. I didn't know what to say to that, Rowan said. What do you say to that? I don't know. She looked at him. You have kids? No. She absorbed that, drank some coffee. She's not going to understand why he did it. Not for years, probably. Her voice was controlled in the manner of someone who has had practice at it, the specific vocal discipline of a woman who is needed to be functional in situations that offered every excuse not to be. I'm not sure I understand why he did it. He was losing everything, Cade said. He was losing visitation rights because he stopped showing up. Her voice gained an edge. Not loud, that same control holding, but the edge was there. He had 3 visits scheduled in the last 2 months. He made one of them. I'm not the one who filed to reduce access. My attorney filed because Mason wasn't using the access he had. Do you know why he stopped showing up? She looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her face. What are you actually asking me? I'm asking if there's something going on with Mason beyond what shows on the surface. Beyond losing his job and falling behind on rent, and apparently deciding the solution to that was to put our 10-year-old daughter in the back of a car, and... She stopped, pressed her lips together. When she spoke again, the edge was still there, but different, gone ragged at one end, the edge of something that wasn't only anger. No, I don't know of anything beyond that. I stopped knowing what was going on with Mason about 14 months ago. That's when communication became impossible. What changed 14 months ago? She wrapped both hands tighter around the paper cup. I don't know. Something did. He went from difficult and sad, which was what he'd been since the divorce, to just gone. Not physically. He was still showing up for visits, calling when he was supposed to call, but something behind his eyes went somewhere else and it never came back. She paused. I thought it was drugs. I had him tested as part of the custody modification. Came back clean. 14 months ago. Cade made a note of that in the part of his brain that had been running the timeline. Did he have any new people in his life around that time? New friends? New employer? Anyone? Rowan looked at him with the careful attention of a person recalculating something. Why do you want to know this? Because I think Mason Grady got caught up in something, Cade said, and I think it's bigger than a bad custody decision. The silence in the office was broken only by Ellie's breathing and the distant sound of engines outside. There was someone, Rowan said finally, a man he mentioned once. I don't remember when exactly, winter, maybe, of last year. He said it once, not as anything significant. A guy named Carver said he'd helped him out with some work when the heating company cut his hours. Carver? First name or last? I don't know. That's all I heard. Cade stood up from the desk. He looked at Ellie sleeping, and at Nora on the floor, and at Rowan in the chair, and he thought about a man named Carver who appeared in someone's life during a difficult winter and helped out with some work, and the particular shape that kind of help tended to take. I need you to stay here tonight, he said. Both of them. Don't go home yet. Rowan looked up at him sharply. Why? He didn't want to answer that question yet. He didn't have enough to give her an answer that would be more reassuring than terrifying, and a terrifying answer without enough information was worse than no answer. Because I'm not done looking at this, he said, and until I know the shape of it, I'd rather you were somewhere I can account for. She stared at him for a long moment. She had the look of a woman who was extremely tired of being told to wait by people who didn't give her reasons. You're not a cop, she said. No. You're not my family. No? So why should I? Because 4 hours ago you reported your daughter missing to the police, and they told you to call back at 3, Cade said. Not unkindly, just level. I'm asking you to stay because I think there's more going on here than one bad day and one scared man. And I'd rather be wrong about that than have you drive home to find out I was right. Another long pause. Rowan looked at her daughter. One night, she said, underscore 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 underscore. Trace was waiting for him in the main garage with a look on his face that Cade didn't like. The look wasn't alarm. Trace didn't do alarm. It wasn't part of his operating range. It was the particular expression of a man who has found something he was not entirely sure he wanted to find. Carver, Cade said before Trace could speak. Trace's eyebrows moved slightly. How did you... Rowan mentioned the name. What do you have? Trace set his tablet on the workbench. On the screen was a photograph. Not professional, pulled from somewhere social or municipal. The kind of image that surfaces when you start pulling threads. A man, mid-50s, with the broad build and deliberate posture of someone who'd spent years in situations where posture communicated status. The face was unremarkable in the specific way that some faces practice being unremarkable. Daniel Carver, Trace said. Goes by Carver. He has a business registered in Millhaven, a logistics consulting firm, Carver Transit Solutions, incorporated 14 months ago. 14 months. The number landed exactly where Cade expected it to. Before that, Cade said, this is where it gets interesting. Trace swiped on the tablet. Before that, there's almost nothing. A few addresses in different states over the last decade. A couple of LLCs that dissolved. One arrest in Arkansas 6 years ago. Conspiracy charges, dismissed before trial. And then a very clean stretch of nothing for about 4 years before he shows up in Millhaven and starts a logistics company. Dutch came to stand on Cade's other side, looking at the screen. Clean stretch like someone cleaned it, he said. Or clean stretch like it never existed. Clean stretch like someone with the right connections and the right resources decided it would be more useful for Daniel Carver to have a limited visible history, Trace said. He said it carefully, the way you describe something you've seen before and hoped not to see again. Military surplus, Cade said. That's where my head went. What's in those crates? I don't know yet. But you have a direction. I have a direction, Trace said. He pulled up another screen. Mason Grady worked for Carver Transit Solutions for approximately 4 months, starting 13 months ago. Off-book labor, no tax records, no formal employment documentation. The kind of arrangement that doesn't exist on paper. And Mason took those photographs. My read is yes. My read is Mason Grady got scared of something he saw and started documenting it, and then got scared of what he documented and stopped showing up to his visitation because he was scared of what showing up might bring to his doorstep, or to Ellie's. The garage absorbed that, Dutch said slowly, so he put her in the trunk to protect her. That's the ugly irony of it, Trace said. He was terrified of what would happen if Carver, or anyone connected to Carver, realized he had those photos. He thought if he took Ellie and ran, he thought he was keeping her safe, Cade said. And instead, he gave the police a reason to pull him over and go through his property. Trace paused. Which means those photos are now in evidence. Which means if Carver has anyone inside the department, and with a setup like this, I would be operating on the assumption that he does, then Carver knows by now that Mason was carrying documentation. The implications of that moved through the room like a cold draft. Where's Carver now? Cade said. That I don't know. The business address on the filing is a commercial mail center. The registered agent is an attorney in Denver. Trace met his eyes. But Cade, Carver Transit Solutions lists 3 vehicles. One of them is a silver Chevy Malibu, model year 2009. The room went completely still. Beck had come back in at some point, Cade hadn't noticed when, and was standing near the door with his arms loose at his sides and his young face working through the math of what he'd just heard. Remy and Holt had come in from outside. Everyone who was present, which meant the conversation had stopped being between Cade and Trace and had become something larger. The car belongs to Carver, Dutch said, not a question. The car belongs to the company, Trace said, which amounts to the same thing. So Mason didn't just grab his kid and run in his own car, Dutch said. He grabbed his kid and ran in Carver's car, which means Carver can find that car, which means Carver can find whoever was in it or near it. He looked at Cade. The specific look he gave Cade said, "Us. Carver can find us." Cade walked to the front of the garage and stood in the doorway, looking out at the street. The snow had committed itself now, an inch or more on the ground already. The kind of accumulation that changes how a city sounds, muffles it, makes everything a little more isolated. The neon sign of the bar across the way was reflected in the wet asphalt, broken and elongated. Down the block, a car moved slowly through the intersection with its headlights cutting white channels through the dark. He stood there long enough for the cold to reach him. Behind him, he heard Dutch say to Trace, low, he should have stopped at getting the girl out. And Trace, lower, "Yeah." Cade turned around. He looked at Dutch, who met his eyes with the expression of a man who means something as a statement of fact and not as a criticism, and knows the difference matters. "You think I went too far," Cade said. "I think we're standing in a garage that a man named Carver can now locate if he wants to," Dutch said. "And I think we don't know what Carver does when he wants to locate something." He paused. "That's not accusation. That's geography." "It's both," said Beck from across the room. Several heads turned. Beck looked back at them without apology. "It's geography, and it's also a question about whether we get to decide, right now, tonight, that this club is going to go up against someone who moves gray market cargo and has connections inside the police department. Because that's what staying involved means." He looked at Cade directly. "I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm saying we should say it out loud." The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Cade looked at Beck for a long moment. The kid was right. That was the aggravating thing. He was 26 years old and had been a member for 14 months, and he kept being right, which was its own kind of problem, because being right wasn't the same as understanding the weight of the thing you were right about. "She's asleep on my couch," Cade said. 10 years old. "Her mother's in my office because I asked her to stay because I think the people who were using her ex-husband know his car was here this afternoon." He paused. "What would you have me do with that?" Beck didn't answer. His jaw moved slightly. He looked at the floor. "We didn't go looking for this," Cade said. "A kid came through the door. We do what we do." He picked up his jacket again. "Anyone who doesn't want their name on what comes next should go home. I mean that straight. No disrespect, no memory of it. Go home." Nobody moved. He hadn't expected them to, but he'd needed to give them the choice, because not giving men the choice of whether to follow you into something like this was exactly the kind of leadership that got people killed and clubs destroyed. And he'd been around long enough to know the difference between loyalty and coercion, and to care about it. "Trace," he said. "I need a location on Daniel Carver before morning." "Working on it." "Dutch, I need the building locked down tonight. Anyone who doesn't belong here, I want to know before they're within 50 yards. "Done." "Remy, check on the women, quiet. Don't alarm anyone. Just make sure they're settled." He looked around at the rest of them, the faces under the buzzing lights, the leather and the ink, and the particular kind of tired that comes from choosing a hard life deliberately and not regretting it most of the time. "Nobody talks to anyone outside the club about what we found on that phone. Not tonight. Not until we know what we're dealing with." He was pulling his jacket on when Trace's phone rang. The ringtone cut through the garage like a struck note. Trace looked at the screen. Something happened to his face. "It's Mason Grady," he said. Cade stopped moving. "He's in custody." "This isn't his number. This is coming from a number I don't recognize." Trace looked up. "Someone else is calling from Mason Grady's phone. From the evidence lockup at Millhaven PD." The snow fell outside. The heater hissed. Cade crossed the garage in 4 strides and took the phone from Trace's hand and answered it. The voice on the other end was male, unhurried, carrying the specific quality of confidence that doesn't need to perform itself. It said, "I think you have something of mine, Mr. Mercer, and I'd very much like it back." Then it said Mason Grady's full name and Rowan's full name and Ellie's full name, in that order, the way a man reads items off a list. And then it said Nora's. Cade didn't answer the voice on the phone. He stood in the middle of the garage with Trace's phone pressed against his ear, and he listened to the way the silence on the other end breathed. Patient, unhurried, the silence of a man who had made this kind of call before and knew exactly how long to let it run before the other person cracked. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere behind him, Dutch had gone very still in the particular way large men go still when they're deciding whether to move. Cade said, "You know my name." "I know a great deal about you, Mr. Mercer." The voice was calibrated. No regional accent or an accent so thoroughly managed it had become its own kind of tell. Mid-50s, maybe older. The cadence of a man who was accustomed to rooms where he was the most dangerous thing present. Decorated combat veteran. 2 tours, 10th Mountain Division. Honorable discharge. 12 years operating Iron Wolves MC out of Millhaven, Colorado. No current criminal record, though we both know that's more a matter of what's been documented than what's actually occurred. "What do you want?" Cade said. "Not a question, a function. The shortest path from here to information." "I want the photographs removed from evidence before tomorrow's arraignment," Carver said. "I want the original device returned, and I want the woman and her daughter out of your building within the next 2 hours. And if I don't do those things—" A pause so brief it was almost not a pause. "Then I'll stop making phone calls and start making other kinds of arrangements. You have enough experience to understand what that means without me being specific about it." The garage was very quiet. Cade was aware of the specific quality of attention around him. Trace to his left, Dutch behind him, Beck near the door, several others distributed through the space, all of them listening to one half of a conversation and building the other half from context, with the practiced efficiency of men who'd had to do exactly that in worse situations than this. "I'm going to need more time," Cade said. "You have 2 hours." "I'm going to need more than 2 hours to move people in a snowstorm without drawing attention." A longer pause this time. Cade could hear something in the background. Ambient sound, ventilation, the low register of machinery. Wherever Carver was, it wasn't quiet and it wasn't public. 3 hours, Carver said. "And Mr. Mercer, the girl, the other one, Nora." He said the name with the same flat informational quality as he'd said the others, and that flatness was itself a kind of violence. "She rode her bicycle to your garage this afternoon. I have the footage. I know what she looks like. Keep that in mind when you're making your decisions." The call ended. Cade lowered the phone. He stood there for a moment with it in his hand, looking at the concrete floor between his boots, and he let what had just happened finish settling into him the way you let a blow finish its work before you assess the damage. Then he set the phone on the workbench and turned around. "He's got eyes on the building," he said. The room absorbed that. "How long?" Dutch said. "Don't know. Long enough to have Nora on camera." He looked at Trace. "Cameras in the parking lot. What's out there?" "City camera on the intersection, private security camera on the dry cleaner 2 doors down." Trace was already on his tablet. "The dry cleaner one is networked. If someone with resources and police department access wanted to pull that feed—" "They already have it," Cade said. "Yes." Beck said, "So he knows exactly who was here this afternoon. All of us." "That was always the case the moment we touched that car," Dutch said, without particular emotion. It was a statement of operational reality delivered without blame, which was Dutch's specific gift. The ability to identify the point at which a situation became what it was, without needing to assign fault for it. Cade looked at him. "You were right earlier. I should have stopped at the girl." Dutch met his eyes. "Yeah," he said, "but you didn't, so here we are." "Here we are," Cade agreed. He pulled up a chair and sat down and put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor for approximately 4 seconds. Long enough to let his brain run through the immediate topology of the problem without the interference of other people's breathing. 3 hours. Evidence removal was not something he was going to do. That particular demand was theater, pressure applied to see what shape it made him take. Carver didn't actually expect compliance with the evidence request because Carver understood that a man with no police contacts couldn't pull physical evidence from a department lockup in 3 hours, and a man who called from a detective's phone after hours had enough reach inside Millhaven PD to handle that problem himself if he needed to. What Carver actually wanted was the women out of the building, out of Cade's protection, out of wherever Carver couldn't account for them. That was the tell. That was the thing that mattered. He stood up. Rowan knows something, he said. She doesn't know she knows it, but she does. And Carver needs her somewhere he can talk to her. Talk to her, Dutch repeated, with the specific inflection that stripped the euphemism out of those 3 words. We need to know what she knows before anyone gets moved anywhere, Cade said. Trace. I need everything you have on Carver Transit Solutions in the next 15 minutes. Supply chain, clientele, any paper trail that survived whatever cleanup happened on Carver's history. Whatever direction you were heading with the military surplus angle, go harder. On it. Dutch. Take Remy and do a perimeter. Physical. Every angle on this building, every sight line. I want to know where the camera coverage is and where it isn't. And if we find someone parked on the street watching, note the plate. Don't approach. He held Dutch's eyes for a moment. Not yet. Dutch nodded and pulled on his cut and went. Cade looked at Beck. Beck was watching him with those young eyes that had seen enough to be serious and not quite enough to be settled. I need you to do something uncomfortable, Cade said. What? I need you to go talk to Mason Grady. Beck blinked. He's in lockup. His arraignment is tomorrow morning. They'll have moved him to county by now. Visiting hours are over, but there's a night duty sergeant at Millhaven County who owes the club a favor from 3 years ago, his son. The situation with the DUI. Call him. Tell him you need 15 minutes with Grady and tell him it's about the safety of a minor. That's true. Let him make the judgment call. Cade picked up his jacket. Tell Mason that Carver called, that Carver used Ellie's name and Nora's name. Tell him we need to know everything he knows and we need to know it tonight, because tomorrow morning the photographs become court record and Carver's window for pressure closes, which means his next move is something other than phone calls. Beck stared at him. You think Grady will talk? I think a man who put his daughter in a car trunk because he was scared will talk when you tell him the people he was scared of already know where his daughter is. A pause. That's a cruel thing to tell him. Yes, Cade said. It is. Tell him anyway. Beck took a breath and reached for his phone and stepped away toward the far wall, already dialing. Cade walked to the back office. Underscore, 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 underscore. Rowan looked up when he came in with the particular alertness of a woman who had trained herself over the last 18 months to read the temperature of a room from the sound of the door opening. Ellie was still asleep. Nora had curled up on the floor with a folded jacket under her head, and her eyes were closed, though whether she was actually asleep was harder to assess. She had the quality of a child who had learned that appearing asleep was sometimes safer than admitting you were listening. Cade sat down on the edge of the desk. He kept his voice low. Carver called. Rowan set her coffee cup down with a precision that suggested her hands weren't entirely steady. What? He used a phone that shouldn't have been accessible to him. He knew your name, Ellie's name. Cade paused. He knew Nora's name. Rowan's face underwent a sequence of changes that moved through shock and arrived somewhere colder on the other side of it. How does he know about Nora? Surveillance. He has access to footage from this afternoon. That means he's been watching Mason. She said it flat, working through the logic in real time, the way a person with good instincts processes new information, even when the information is terrifying. He's been watching Mason long enough to know who Mason's daughter knows. Yes. Which means this didn't start today. No, it didn't. Cade leaned forward slightly. Rowan, I need you to think back. 14 months ago, around the time Mason started working for Carver, was there anything unusual? Anything that felt wrong, even if you couldn't have explained why at the time? She was quiet for a moment. The office had the particular stillness of a room where a child is sleeping and the adults are trying to keep the worst of the world on the other side of the walls. Mason started carrying cash, she said finally. We were separated already, but we were still talking about the girls' logistics, pickups, school stuff. I noticed he started paying for things in cash, groceries he dropped off, gas. He'd always been a card guy. She paused. I thought maybe he was budgeting differently because of losing the job. What else? He bought a burner phone. He thought I didn't notice, but Ellie mentioned it. She said Daddy had 2 phones now. I asked him about it once, and he said it was for work. She stopped. Her jaw worked. Work? You couldn't have known what that meant. No, but I should have pushed. Her voice had gone quiet and interior, the voice of a person reviewing a decision tree and finding the nodes where different choices might have led somewhere else. There was one more thing. About 2 months ago, I came to his apartment to drop off Ellie's winter coat. She'd left it there. He didn't know I was coming, and when I knocked, he took too long to answer. And when he finally opened the door, he was wearing the same clothes he'd been wearing the day before, and he looked like he hadn't slept, and there was a man sitting at his kitchen table. Cade went still. Describe him. Older, maybe late 50s. Heavy set, but not soft. The kind of heavy that used to be something else. He had gray hair, very short, and he looked at me when the door opened with... She paused, searching for the right word. Assessment. That's the only word. He looked at me the way you look at something you're deciding the value of. Did Mason introduce him? No. He came to the door and pulled it almost closed behind him so I couldn't see into the apartment, and he took the coat and said thank you and closed the door. She pressed her lips together. That was the last time I was at his apartment. That was Carver, Cade said. Rowan looked at him. In the quiet of the office, with her daughter breathing soft and oblivious on the couch behind her, the understanding of what she'd just said moved across her face with the slowness of something that was too large to process quickly. He was in Mason's apartment, she said. Yes. And Mason was... She stopped. Scared, Cade said. I think Mason has been scared for a long time. I think that's why he stopped showing up to visits. He was trying to keep Ellie away from anything that might lead back to what he'd gotten involved in. He paused. The problem is that by taking her today, he brought Carver's attention directly to her. Rowan's hands came up and pressed against her face for a moment. When they came down, what was underneath was not tears, but something harder. The cold, functional anger of a woman who is done being the person things happen to. What does Carver want? He wants you out of this building. Why? Because you're somewhere he can't control right now. She looked at him with the direct quality that he'd noticed from the beginning, even in the parking lot, even covered in relief and the adrenaline crash of finding her daughter. She'd had that quality, the ability to look at a situation and see its architecture rather than just its surface. So we don't leave, she said. That's my position, Cade said. But you need to understand what that means. Staying here isn't comfortable. It may not be safe. What I can tell you is that going wherever Carver wants you to go is worse. I'm not going anywhere Carver wants me to go, she said. The words were completely level. There was no drama in them, which made them more convincing than if there had been. A knock at the door. Trace. He opened it a fraction and looked at Cade. You need to come out here. Underscore, 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 underscore. Trace had his tablet on the workbench and 3 browsers open across the screen, and the look on his face was the one Cade associated with information that had just reordered the problem from the ground up. Carver Transit Solutions, Trace said. I went at it from the supply chain angle, like you said. The company files cargo manifests with the state as part of their operating license. The manifests are public record. I went back 14 months. He zoomed in on a section of the screen. Most of it is legitimate. Dry goods, mechanical components, industrial equipment, But there are 3 manifests in the last 8 months where the listed cargo weight doesn't match the listed contents by a significant margin, and all 3 of those shipments terminated at the same receiving address. He pulled up an address, Industrial District, east side of Millhaven, a street Cade knew, warehouse corridor, the kind of block that was busy during the day and completely dark at night. And here's the part that changes things, Trace said. He swiped again. A name appeared on the screen, a company name listed as the receiving party on all 3 of those manifests. Cade read it. He read it again. Then he looked up at Trace. "That's a shell," he said. "Yes," Trace said. "Incorporated in Delaware 18 months ago, no physical address, single registered agent. Dissolves automatically in another 6 months, standard temporary structure." But the name is the problem. Trace met his eyes. "I ran it through every registry I could access in the last 20 minutes. That company name and that exact name with those exact letters appears in one other place in any public record I can find, a federal contracting database, a DoD subcontractor roster from 2017. He paused. 10th Mountain Division, Fort Drum. The garage went so quiet Cade could hear the snow against the windows. 10th Mountain Division, his years, the specific coordinates of the part of his life that he had sealed off and built the garage over and tried to leave somewhere it couldn't reach the present. "It's not a coincidence," Dutch said. He'd come back in at some point. Cade hadn't heard him. His voice was entirely without inflection. That was how serious it was. "No," Trace said. "It's not a coincidence. He knew who you were before today," Dutch said. "He knew what unit you served with. He built a piece of his operation using a name that you would recognize." He looked at Cade steadily. "He wanted you to find this, or he wanted you to find it at a specific time, in a specific way." Cade stood very still at the workbench. The thing he hadn't said to anyone in this room, hadn't said out loud in years, was assembling itself in his chest with the patient, terrible inevitability of a structure that had been undermining its own foundation for a long time and had finally run out of material to delay the collapse. He hadn't gone looking for what was in those crates. He hadn't gone looking for Daniel Carver. He hadn't gone looking for any of this. But he had been in this zip code, in this life, running this particular garage, and an 11-year-old girl had come through his door. And the name on that DoD subcontractor roster was a name he knew. Not because he'd looked it up, because he'd said it himself once, in a debrief room at Fort Drum in 2008, in reference to a supply chain irregularity that his unit had flagged and that had been officially noted and then officially set aside by someone further up the chain. He'd let it be set aside. He'd been 25 years old, and he'd been told by someone with more stars on their collar that some things were above his pay grade, and he'd believed it. Or he'd told himself he'd believed it, which was not the same thing, and he'd known it wasn't the same thing every day since. "Carver," Cade said. His voice came out level. "What was his military service?" "Pull it." Trace was already ahead of him. "That's what I've been trying to find. There's nothing under Daniel Carver, but if I assume the name is as constructed as the rest of his history," he was typing as he spoke, "and I run the physical description, age range, Arkansas connection, and the DoD subcontractor linked together." He stopped typing. He looked at the screen. He looked at Cade. "His name isn't Carver," Trace said. "Or it wasn't. 18 years ago, his name was Dennis Carvel, warrant officer, Army Logistics. He was the supply chain officer who processed your unit's equipment requests out of Bagram, 2007 to 2008. The workbench was solid under Cade's hands. He was aware of this specifically, the physical solidity of the thing, the realness of the grain under his palms, because the rest of the room had taken on the slightly unreal quality of a place where something enormous had just shifted. Dennis Carvel. He hadn't thought that name in a decade. He hadn't needed to. The man had been a footnote in a debrief, a name attached to a requisition irregularity, someone else's problem eventually. Except apparently not. "He's been in Millhaven for 14 months, Cade said. "Yes. And I've been in Millhaven for 12 years. "Yes. He set up here after I was already here. Trace was very careful with the next word. Yes. Beck had appeared from the far side of the garage. That means he picked this city because of you, he said. There was no accusation in his voice this time. He'd gotten past that into something that was less comfortable than accusation, the plain arithmetic of a situation that didn't need blame to be damning. He built his operation here because you were here, because he knew your history and your service record, and he knew you had enough reach and enough reputation in this city that having you compromised, or having you looking like you were compromised, was worth something. Worth something to who? Dutch said. To whoever is on the other end of those cargo manifests, Trace said. The answer was in the room, and nobody said it. Sometimes the weight of a thing is in the not saying. Cade straightened up from the workbench. He walked to the garage door and stood with his hand on the frame, looking out at the street through the small window in the metal door. The snow was deep enough now to have covered the tire tracks in the lot. The street was empty and white, and the neon from the bar across the way painted a smear of color across the unmarked surface. He'd spent 12 years building something clean. That was the project, the actual project, under the garage and the club and the daily mechanics of running both. 12 years of trying to be someone who pulled people toward safety rather than toward the specific kind of harm that followed men like him home from the places they'd been. He'd been careful. He'd kept the club out of things that would compromise it. He'd made rules and enforced them, and when people told him he was paranoid, he'd let them think that because paranoia was more comfortable for them than the truth, which was that he knew exactly what kind of attention certain kinds of trouble brought. And someone had set up shop in his city 14 months ago specifically because of who he was, and had spent 14 months building a structure that led, through a scared divorced man in a yellow work jacket and a car trunk, and a child on a bicycle, directly to his front door. He'd been managed for over a year. He'd been watched and studied, and the pieces around him had been positioned, and he hadn't seen it because he hadn't been looking for it, because he'd believed the clean life he'd built was actually clean. The photographs, he said without turning around. The ones on Mason's phone. The crates in the warehouse. Yes, Trace said. He sent those to Mason deliberately. He knew Mason had been documenting things. He sent them through a disconnected number because he wanted them on Mason's phone when Mason got picked up. He wanted them in evidence. Cade turned around. He wanted us to find them. He wanted Trace to pull the thread. He wanted us to be standing here right now, tonight, knowing exactly as much as we know, because a man named Daniel Carver, who operates a logistics company in Millhaven, is a problem. But an outlaw motorcycle club that's been investigating that logistics company and can be connected to a custody abduction, and has a woman and her child on the premises. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Dutch sat down heavily on a stool. This was remarkable. Dutch never sat. Not in situations, not when things were moving. And the simple fact of it communicated the weight of the moment more clearly than anything else could have. "We're the frame," he said. He needed someone to hang this on when it comes apart. Someone whose credibility is already questioned. Someone who the police will believe went dirty before they'll believe anything else. "He's been building our file," Trace said. His voice was stripped down to its bare components, the analytical precision that took over when emotion would compromise the function. "Every contact we've had with Mason Grady's situation today. It's all documented. Police calls, camera footage, the phone. He can present a narrative where we were involved in Grady's operation from the beginning. Where today wasn't us helping, it was us managing a situation that got out of hand." Beck said very quietly, "Is that why he wanted the women out? Not to get to them? To make it look like we let them go? To make it look like we released them when things got complicated?" Cade looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "That's why." The snow fell outside. The heater ran. 12 men in a garage looked at each other across the wreckage of the last 6 hours and understood that the problem they were in was not the problem they'd thought they were in, and the distinction was the difference between a fire and a burning building, and they were standing in the latter. Then Trace's tablet lit up. An alert he'd set running on the warehouse address. He read it. He read it again. He looked up. "There's a truck," he said. "The city traffic system. I've been monitoring the intersection cameras near that warehouse address. A truck just backed up to the loading dock. A big one. He turned the tablet so Cade could see the grainy timestamp image. They're moving the crates. Cade looked at the image, at the truck, at the dock, at the timestamp in the corner, which showed 11:47 p.m. If those crates leave Millhaven tonight, Trace said, there's no evidence. There's no cargo manifest irregularity to point to. There's no physical record of anything except us. Our names, our building, our connection to Mason Grady, and 12 photographs in a police evidence lockup that Carver will have pulled before morning. Cade put his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked at Dutch. Dutch looked back at him with the eyes of a man who had followed him into bad places before and was willing to follow him into this one and needed one thing from Cade first, which was for Cade to say out loud what they were going to do. "We're going to that warehouse," Cade said. "Tonight," Dutch said. "Right now." "How many?" Cade looked around the room, at the men who hadn't gone home when he'd given them the chance. At Beck, who was young and had kept being right all night. At Trace, who was already saving the camera image to 3 different locations. At Remy and Holt near the door. "Enough," he said. He was pulling his gloves on when the back office door opened. Rowan was standing in the doorway. She'd heard. The office wasn't soundproofed, and they hadn't been quiet, and she'd heard at least enough to know the shape of it, because the expression on her face had moved past fear into something with harder edges. "There's something else," she said. "Something I didn't tell you." Cade stopped. "Mason gave me something," she said, "about 3 weeks ago. He came to drop Ellie off, and before he left, he pressed a USB drive into my hand and said, 'Keep this somewhere safe and don't tell anyone.' And I thought—" She stopped, pressed a breath out. "I thought he was being dramatic. I thought it was about the divorce. I didn't look at it. I put it in the zippered pocket of my work bag, and I forgot about it." She looked at Cade with the focused intensity of someone who had just connected 2 things that should have been connected weeks ago. "My work bag is in my car." The garage was completely silent. "And my car," Rowan said, "is parked on the street outside." The USB drive was the size of a thumbnail, and it was sitting in a zippered pocket in a bag in a car parked on a public street at 11:53 p.m., while a man named Daniel Carver moved cargo out of a warehouse 4 miles away. Cade was already moving before Rowan finished the sentence. "Keys," he said. "What?" "Your car keys. Give them to me." She reached into her coat pocket and produced them, and he took them and looked at Trace. "Where's the camera coverage on the street?" Trace was at his tablet. "City camera covers the intersection. The dry cleaner camera covers the front of this building and about 40 feet of sidewalk in each direction. Beyond that," he zoomed, "there's a gap. Her car is parked in the gap." "How confident are you in that?" 60%. The dry cleaner camera angle isn't precise from this image. Could be covering more than I think. 60%. In another life, in a different theater, 60% would have been a reasonable number to work with. Standing in a garage in Millhaven, Colorado, with a 10-year-old asleep in the back office and a man named Carver 4 miles away loading trucks, 60% felt like a coin flip over something that couldn't afford to land wrong. "I'll go," Beck said. Everyone looked at him. "I'm the one they have the least on," he said. "I wasn't here for the trunk. I came in after. If they've been pulling footage, I'm the face they've had the least time to run." He held out his hand for the keys. "I walk out, I get the bag out of the car, I walk back. 60 seconds. Cade looked at him for a moment. He thought about saying no. He thought about saying it should be him, which was true in the sense that the weight of all of this was his to carry, but was false in the operational sense that Beck had just articulated correctly. He put the keys in Beck's hand. "Don't run," Cade said. "Don't check if you're being watched. Just walk." Beck nodded once and went out the side door. The garage counted seconds. Trace had the dry cleaner camera feed on his tablet, the image grainy and gray-green in the night vision mode, and they watched Beck appear at the edge of the frame, unhurried, hands in his jacket pockets, and walk to the car parked at the curb, and open the passenger door, and reach inside, and close the door, and walk back, and disappear from the frame. 38 seconds. The side door opened, and Beck came in with a worn canvas tote bag over his shoulder, and a look on his face like a man who had just held a breath, until his vision went spotty. He handed the bag to Cade without a word. Cade found the zippered interior pocket. The USB drive was there, small and black and unremarkable, the kind of thing you'd lose in a drawer without noticing. He held it between his thumb and forefinger for a moment. 3 weeks. Rowan had been carrying this for 3 weeks without knowing what it was. "Laptop," he said. Trace produced one from the back shelf and set it on the workbench, and Cade plugged the drive in, and they waited the 3 seconds it took to mount, and then the directory opened, and they all looked at the screen. 47 files, a mix of document formats and images, and 2 video files. The documents were spreadsheets. Dense, columnar, the kind of financial record that takes a trained eye to read but communicates its nature immediately to anyone who's seen one before. Numbers that didn't correspond to any legitimate cargo volume. Transaction records in amounts that had too many zeros to be miscellaneous freight charges. Dates going back 22 months. And names. Not many names. 4. 3 of them were unfamiliar. Probably shell entities, probably incorporated in states chosen for their disclosure laws. But the 4th name, appearing in 6 of the transaction records as the receiving party for payments totaling an amount that Cade didn't say out loud when he read it, was a name he knew. A Millhaven name. Trace said it first very quietly. "That's a city council member." "Yes," Cade said. "Hargrove," Dutch said from behind them. Cade could hear the specific quality in Dutch's voice. Not surprise, but the particular exhaustion of someone who has suspected something for a long time and taken no pleasure in being confirmed. "I've met him twice. Fundraiser 2 years ago. Ribbon cutting on the East Side development." He paused. "The East Side development, the warehouse corridor." The warehouse corridor, the same address on Carver's cargo manifests, the same block Cade had been looking at on a traffic camera feed 4 minutes ago. The development project that had rezoned 6 blocks of Millhaven's industrial east side and pushed out 12 existing businesses and brought in new construction that had been controversial and moved unusually fast through the permitting process and had been Hargrove's signature accomplishment of his current term, and had, apparently, included a warehouse that Carver Transit Solutions had been using for 22 months to move cargo that didn't match its manifest. "Open the videos," Trace said. Cade clicked the first one. It was interior footage, shot from what looked like a phone propped against something. Bad angle. The bottom third of the frame was a shelf or a surface of some kind, but the room was visible. A conference room or a room being used as one. Folding table, chairs, harsh overhead light. 3 men, 2 of them with their backs to the camera. One facing it, not knowing he was being recorded, talking with the loose confidence of a man in a room he considers private. The man facing the camera was Hargrove. Cade had seen him on local news enough times to place the face immediately. Mid-60s, silver-haired, the practiced warmth of a career public servant draped over something cooler underneath. He was talking to the 2 men with their backs to the camera. The audio was poor. Mason had not been a trained surveillance operative, but certain phrases came through. Schedule. The February window. If the federal audit goes where I think it's going, we move everything by the end of January. And then, clearly, unmistakably, Carver handles the logistics. I handle the exposure. Cade stopped the video. "That's enough," he said. The garage was silent for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. "Mason had this for 3 weeks," Dutch said, "and he gave it to Rowan instead of going to the police." "He didn't trust the police," Trace said. "Given that Carver called us from a phone in a police evidence lockup, Mason's judgment on that point was not unsound." "He should have come here," Dutch said. "He didn't know us," Cade said. "He knew a car in a parking lot and a garage with a light on." Another silence. "Hargrove is on the Public Safety Committee," Trace said. He said it with the specific, careful neutrality of a man choosing the precise weight of each word. "He has oversight of the police department budget, which means he has relationships inside the department. Which means Carver's access to the evidence lockup tonight didn't require much," Cade said. "One call to the right person." Dutch stood up from the stool. He did it slowly, the way a geological event occurs slowly. And when he was fully upright, the decision was already visible in his posture before he spoke. "We can't take this to the police," he said. "No. And we can't wait until morning because the cargo is moving tonight, and by morning the manifest will be amended and the chain of evidence will have been managed by whoever Carver has inside the department." "Yes. So we go to the warehouse," Dutch said. "And we do what?" Cade looked at him. He thought about 12 years of careful. He thought about the rules he'd made and kept. He thought about the debrief room at Fort Drum and a supply chain irregularity, and a man with more stars on his collar telling him it was above his pay grade. "We document it," Cade said, "before it moves, everything on that truck, every crate, every label, every face we can get on camera, and we get it somewhere Carver can't reach before morning. And if Carver's people are already there, then we deal with that when we get there." Dutch looked at him steadily. "That's not an answer." "No," Cade said, "it's not." He looked around the room. "But it's the only one I've got." He copied the USB drive contents to 3 separate cloud locations using Trace's encrypted accounts while Dutch went to get the bikes warmed up, and then he walked to the back office and opened the door. Rowan was standing in the middle of the room. Ellie was still asleep. Nora was sitting up on the floor, very awake, arms around her knees, watching the door with the alert dark eyes of a child who had understood, probably for the last hour, that the adults around her were moving towards something. "We're going out," Cade said to Rowan. "Remy and Holt are staying here. The door stays locked. You don't open it for anyone except me, Dutch, or Trace. You've seen all 3 faces. Anyone else, you don't answer." Rowan looked at him. "What was on the drive?" "Enough," he said. "It's somewhere safe now, multiple places." He paused. "Whatever happens tonight, that information exists independent of us, independent of Mason. It can't be taken back." She absorbed that. "You're going to the warehouse." "Yes." "Is this—" she started, and stopped, and started again. "Is this something you're going to come back from?" It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer, and he didn't have one clean enough to give her, so he said, "I intend to." She held his eyes for a moment. Then she nodded once, the nod of a woman who has accepted risks she can't control before and survived them, and carries the weight of that survival in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her hands. He looked at Nora. She looked back at him with those eyes that had seen the inside of a day that should never have happened to someone her age. "Is Ellie going to be okay?" she said. It was the same question she'd asked in the garage hours ago, the very first thing she'd said to him, and the fact that she was asking it again, not "Are you going to be okay?" Not "Are we safe?" but "Is Ellie going to be okay?" said something about who Nora was that Cade thought she'd spend a lifetime being without ever fully knowing it. Yes, he said. This one he was certain of. She's going to be okay. He closed the door. Underscore, 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 underscore. 7 motorcycles in the snow at midnight make a sound that belongs to no other context. It is not a comfortable sound. It is not meant to be. It moves through the cold air with a physical presence, a vibration that precedes the machines and outlasts them, the way thunder outlasts lightning. And when 7 of them roll in formation through the empty streets of a sleeping city, even the snow seems to quiet itself. Cade rode point. Dutch to his left and 1 back. Trace behind Dutch. Beck in the middle of the formation, which was not where the youngest member usually rode, but Cade wanted him visible and close tonight. Remy and Holt had stayed at the garage. The remaining 4 men filled the spaces behind, all of them silent, all of them running without excess motion, the compact professionalism of people who have agreed that this is the thing and are past deliberation. The east side was 4 miles and 6 minutes in ordinary circumstances. Tonight, with the snow and the empty streets, it was 4 miles and 8 minutes. And the 8 minutes had the compressed, heavy quality of time that is moving towards something inevitable. Cade killed the lights 2 blocks out. They rolled the last stretch on momentum and throttle discipline, engines dropping to a mutter, the sound of the wheels on packed snow more audible than the engines for the last 100 yards. He pulled into the shadow of a building across the street from the warehouse address, and they stopped in a loose cluster, and for a moment nobody spoke, and everyone looked. The warehouse was a converted industrial space, metal-sided, high roof, loading dock on the near face. The dock lights were on. A truck, engine running, exhaust curling white in the cold air, backed up to the dock with its rear doors open. 2 men in the dock light, moving crates on a hand truck. A third man standing at the dock's edge, not working, watching the street. Not with the casual attention of a site supervisor, with the specific methodical scan of someone who'd been told to watch. 3 visible, Dutch said low. More inside, Trace said. Probably. Loading's half done, Beck said. He was reading the dock with his head slightly forward, that quality of focused attention that good young men in difficult situations develop quickly. The stacks on the left side are gone, right side's still there. Cade looked at the truck, at the dock, at the man watching the street. He looked at the distance from their position to the warehouse entrance. A personnel door 20 feet left of the dock, closed, probably locked from inside. He looked at the camera mounted on the corner of the building. Trace, he said. Already on it. Trace had his phone out. He'd been working the traffic and security network for the last 8 minutes. Cameras on a local network, it's not sophisticated. A pause. Done. They're looping from 40 minutes ago. How long do we have before someone notices? Depends if anyone's monitoring in real time. If it's just recording, could be hours. If someone's watching. We move now, Cade said. He looked at Dutch. Dutch looked back. The shorthand of years. Everything communicated in a look that would have taken 3 minutes to say in words. Dutch nodded. Beck, Polly, dock approach. You're moving cargo. You're workers. You don't exist until you do. Stay on the dock side and keep the truck between you and the watcher. Don't engage unless engaged. He looked at the others. Trace and I go through the personnel door. Morrow stacks, perimeter, near and far. You see a vehicle that doesn't belong. You signal. You do not stop it. You signal. What's the signal? Morrow said. He was 40, quiet, former long-haul trucker who'd joined the club 6 years ago after something had happened on a route in Nevada that he'd never fully explained and no one had asked him to. Harley, Cade said. Simply. 1 engine rev. The most natural sound on the block. He got off his bike. The cold hit him the way cold does at midnight in December when you've been inside for hours. Total and immediate. The temperature finding every gap in his jacket and gloves and the collar of his shirt. His breath came out visible. His boots on the packed snow made a compression sound with each step, soft and specific. He crossed the street with Trace beside him, both of them at a measured pace, not walking fast enough to look urgent and not walking slow enough to look uncertain. The pace of men who know where they are going and have a reason to be there, which was a performance, but a trained one. The personnel door was padlocked from the outside with a combination lock that Trace dealt with in 11 seconds using a shim tool from his jacket pocket while Cade stood at his shoulder and watched the street watcher at the dock 40 feet away. Scan left, scan right, scan left, not look at them. The door opened inward onto a utility corridor. Concrete, fluorescent tube lighting, the smell of industrial lubricant and cold air, and something else under it that Cade placed after 2 steps as the specific smell of equipment that had been in storage. Military surplus equipment has a smell. It's not dramatic. It's preservation compound and metal and compressed packing material and the ghost of purpose. And he knew that smell, had known it since he was 19 years old. And it reached up from his memory and put its hand around his throat in the utility corridor of a warehouse in Millhaven, Colorado, at midnight in the snow. He kept moving. The corridor opened onto the main floor. Cade stopped in the shadow of the doorway and looked. The main floor was large, a full city block of floor space. The ceiling, 30 feet up with steel crossbeams and mounted lighting that was currently running at half power. throwing the far corners into shadow. The right side stacks Beck had clocked from outside were there, wooden crates on pallets, ranging from the size of a footlocker to the size of a refrigerator. There were markings on some of them, not the shipping labels from the photographs, those had apparently been removed, but the indentations where labels had been, the clean rectangular ghosts of removed documentation. 2 men working the interior, one at the right side stacks with a scanning tool, logging. One operating a forklift, moving a pallet toward the dock door. And in the far left corner, in the shadow the half-powered lights hadn't reached, a figure standing with a phone to his ear. Cade couldn't see the face from this distance, but the broad, deliberate build was recognizable. The deliberate posture of a man accustomed to rooms where he was the most dangerous thing present. Carver, not 4 miles away managing things from a distance. Here, in the warehouse, at midnight. Which meant either the situation had escalated enough to require his physical presence, or he'd been here all along, which meant he'd known since before the call that things were moving faster than his timeline. Trace touched Cade's arm once, a single point of contact. Cade looked at him and Trace held up his phone, showing the screen. Camera app, already running, the phone angled to capture the floor. Documentation. This was the job. Get what was on those crates and get it out. Cade nodded. They moved along the wall. The forklift was loud enough to cover the sound of their boots on the concrete, and the 2 interior workers were focused on the task of moving inventory under a compressed timeline, and Carver was on his phone in the corner, and for 30 seconds the mechanics of the situation worked in their favor, and they covered 60 feet of wall and got close enough to the nearest pallet stack that Trace could angle the phone camera at the crate faces. Cade looked at the crates. The labels were gone, but the crates themselves were marked. Stenciled markings on the wood, faded and partially obscured but present, the kind of markings that don't wash off because they're cut into the material during manufacture. Stock numbers. Contract codes. The specific alphanumeric language of military logistics that he'd spent 2 years reading and filing and moving through supply chains at Bagram. He read them. He read them twice. Then he looked at Trace, and Trace looked at him, and the same understanding arrived in both of them at the same time, delivered by the same knowledge base, because Trace had been intel, and Cade had been in the field, and between them they had enough of the language to read what was in front of them. These were not surplus. This was not old equipment being resold through gray channels. The stock numbers on these crates were current generation. The contract codes were from procurement cycles that had run in the last 3 years. This was not surplus because it had never been officially removed from active inventory. It had been diverted. Someone, through a chain that ran from a DoD logistics process to a warrant officer who'd changed his name to a city council member in Millhaven, Colorado, had been diverting active military equipment and moving it through a civilian logistics company to a destination that the cargo manifests listed as industrial clients, and that Cade was very certain, looking at the size and quantity of the crates, was something else entirely. Trace had his phone camera running, and his expression had the controlled blankness of a man whose brain was processing something that required all available resources. Then the forklift stopped. The engine idled down. The operator climbed off. Cade heard him say something to the other interior worker. A question. A direction. Words lost under the ambient sound of the loading dock. And then both of them moved toward the dock door and through it, and they were alone on the floor, except for Carver in the corner, who had lowered his phone, who was looking directly at them. The distance between Cade and Carver was approximately 40 feet of concrete floor and 22 years of history and 1 moment of decision in a debrief room at Fort Drum, where Cade had been told to let something go, and had let it go, and had built a life over the place where he'd let it go. And now the thing he'd let go was standing 40 feet away in a half-lit warehouse, looking at him with the flat, assessing expression of a man who had planned for this exact moment. "Mr. Mercer," Carver said. His voice in the warehouse space was different from his voice on the phone, larger, more resonant, the voice of a man in his own space. "You're more thorough than I expected. I expected you to send someone." Cade didn't move. "You said you wanted something back." "I did." "You were already here." "I was already here," Carver agreed. He took 3 steps forward into better light, unhurried, and Cade updated the physical read. Mid-50s, 220 pounds, carried it well. Not a desk man. Had never been a desk man. The phone call was a slight pause, something that might in a different face have been amusement. An assessment. I wanted to see what you do with 3 hours. And you're here. He spread his hands slightly, a gesture that said, the space between us is small, and I'm comfortable with that. Which tells me you're either very brave or very committed, or you haven't fully understood yet what you're standing in. I've understood it, Cade said. Then you understand that the documentation your friend is making on his phone has nowhere to go. The department has the device and the photographs. Your credibility with any federal agency is complicated by your history and your club and the very fortunate coincidence that a woman and her child spent tonight in your building following a custody incident that you were materially involved in. He tilted his head slightly. The story writes itself, Mr. Mercer. The USB drive, Cade said. A pause. Shorter than the others, but there. Where is it? Somewhere you can't reach it. Everything is somewhere I can reach it. The video of Hargrove is uploaded to 4 servers right now, Cade said. 3 of them are encrypted and account locked. The 4th has an automatic release timer. This was partially true. The upload had happened. The timer was something he was creating in real time, in his voice, as a pressure instrument. You have one option that doesn't result in that footage reaching a federal inbox before morning. Carver looked at him. The assessment in his gaze was thorough and unhurried, the look of a man running probabilities. What's the option? You stop loading that truck, Cade said. You and every person in this building walks out, and you don't come back, and you don't make any more phone calls to anyone associated with Mason Grady, his family, or my club. And Millhaven PD receives an anonymous package tomorrow containing documentation of a city council member's financial relationship with a logistics company that has been misrepresenting cargo manifests to the state. And I walk away. From Millhaven, tonight. A long silence. The dock sounds continued outside. The hand truck, boots on the dock surface, the truck engine idling. In the warehouse, the 2 of them looked at each other across 40 feet and the particular weight of a history that had been operating unseen for over a year. You're not in a position to make that offer credibly, Carver said. You have a phone recording a warehouse floor. I have 6 men on site and legal structures that will take years to unwind. The federal case alone. I know about Carvel, Cade said. The warehouse went quiet in a specific, different way. Carvel, went very still. Not the stillness of someone caught, the stillness of someone recalibrating at a deep level, updating a model that had just been shown to be wrong about something fundamental. Bagram, Cade said. 2007. The requisition irregularities your unit processed. The report I filed that went to Colonel Whitmore and disappeared. He paused. I let it go. I shouldn't have. That's on me. He let that sit for a second, but I didn't forget it. And the name Carvel is in my written record of that debrief, in a document I filed with my JAG representative before my discharge, that has been sitting in a private attorney's office in Denver for 10 years with instructions to be opened if I'm ever the subject of a federal criminal investigation. It was true. All of it was true. He'd done it as a precaution years ago for reasons that had seemed paranoid at the time. Carver looked at him. You've been carrying this for a long time, Carver said. The register of his voice had changed slightly. Not softened, changed in the way that voices change when the speaker is making a genuine reassessment. Yes, Cade said. So have I, Carver said. And something in the way he said it, some compression of what those 4 words contained, landed in the room with unexpected weight. And Cade looked at the man across the concrete and for 1 second saw not the operation and the cargo and the leverage and the phone call with the children's names, but something older and more human and more tired, and he had to close it off immediately because that was exactly what made Carver dangerous, the capacity to show you something real in the middle of something that was entirely constructed. The dock door opened. Dutch stepped through. He was carrying nothing. His hands were visible, but Dutch at full height in a warehouse doorway with that particular quality of physical gravity he carried required no equipment to communicate exactly what it communicated. Behind him, barely visible in the dock light, Beck and Paulie. Carver looked at Dutch, looked at the doorway, looked back at Cade. "You came in through the front," he said. "We came in through both," Cade said. Another pause. Carver's jaw worked slightly, the first physical indication of something being processed under the surface of that controlled expression. He looked at the phone still in Trace's hand. He looked at the crates. He looked at Cade. "The timer," he said, "on the server. What's the window?" 2 hours, Cade said. Another construction, but the math was close enough to plausible. Carver was quiet for a very long time. Outside, the truck engine idled. The snow fell on the roof with the silence that snow has, and underneath it, the warehouse breathed with the compressed tension of men who had arrived at the exact point where the next thing that happened would determine everything that came after. Then Carver reached into his jacket pocket. Every person in the warehouse moved, a collective physical adjustment, the reflexive realignment of bodies towards threat assessment, and Carver stopped with his hand still in the pocket and looked at Cade with something that was almost patience and said, "Phone. I'm getting my phone." He produced it slowly, looked at it, dialed a number and put it to his ear and said 4 words to whoever answered, "We're done here tonight." He lowered the phone. "I want the timer stopped," he said. "The Hargrove footage. I want 48 hours before anything goes public. Hargrove is one piece of this and not the piece that matters to me." "That's not my deal to make," Cade said. "Then whose deal is it?" "That's for a federal prosecutor to determine," Cade said. "What I can tell you is that if Mason Grady, his daughter, his ex-wife, and a child named Nora make it to tomorrow without anyone approaching them, the documentation that goes to the federal inbox includes a note that Daniel Carver, or Dennis Carvel, your preference, demonstrated cooperation." He paused. "That's the best I can do." Carver looked at him for a long time. The dock sounds had stopped. Outside, through the warehouse walls, Cade could hear the wind moving through the empty block, and somewhere in the near distance, 2, 3 streets over, the sound of motorcycle engines, idling, patient, the sound of men who were in their own weather waiting for a signal. Carver put his phone back in his pocket. "Your club," he said. He said it with something that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite contempt, and was somewhere in the territory between the two, where complicated assessments live. "I spent 14 months thinking you were the liability, the thing I could use." He looked around the warehouse, at the half-loaded truck, at the crates, at the concrete floor under the half-powered lights. "I built the wrong read." "People do," Cade said. Carver walked past him toward the personnel door, his men in the warehouse, the 2 who'd been loading, a third who'd materialized from somewhere in the back, followed without being told to, the trained movement of people who'd served under someone long enough to read the directive in posture. At the personnel door, Carver stopped without turning around. "Bagram," he said. "The irregularity I processed in 2008, the requisition your unit flagged." A pause. "Whitmore told me it had been buried, that your report went nowhere." Another pause, longer. "I spent the next 6 years thinking that was true." Then he went through the door, and the corridor beyond swallowed him, and the sound of his footsteps on concrete faded, and the warehouse was empty, except for the iron wolves and the crates and the idling truck outside, and the particular silence of a room where something enormous had just tipped but not yet fallen. Trace lowered his phone. "We have everything," he said. His voice was careful. "The crate markings, the manifests, the interior layout." He looked at Cade. "And Whitmore." Cade looked at him. "Whitmore," Trace said. "Colonel Whitmore, the one who buried your report." He turned his tablet. On the screen was the 3rd transaction record from Mason's USB drive, the one Cade hadn't finished reading in the garage because things had moved too fast. The name in the receiving column of that transaction was not Hargrove, and was not a shell company, and was not Carver. It was Whitmore, a general now, based in Washington, still serving. The truck engine idled outside. The The snow fell on the roof. Dutch looked at Cade from across the warehouse with an expression that contained everything and asked nothing. The expression of a man who will follow his president through whatever door this turns out to be and only needs to know which direction they're pointing. Cade looked at the name on the screen and felt 12 years of careful living and 6 rules and 1 decision in a debrief room in Fort Drum all arrive at the same point simultaneously, which was here, which was now, which was a warehouse in Millhaven with a USB drive uploaded to 4 servers and a general's name in a financial record, and the sound of his brother's bikes on the winter street outside. And he understood that what happened next was going to require him to walk through a door he had spent a long time making sure he never had to open again. The truck left the warehouse at 12:41 a.m. Not loaded, empty. The dock doors closed behind it, and the loading dock lights went off one by one, and the building went dark in the way that buildings go dark when the people who were using them for the wrong reasons have decided the cost of continuing has exceeded the benefit, and the street returned to the quiet white vacancy of a December night in a city that was mostly asleep. Cade stood on the sidewalk outside the warehouse and watched the truck's taillights disappear around the corner and kept watching the empty corner for a moment after the lights were gone. Behind him, the bikes were still running. He could feel the vibration of them through the soles of his boots on the packed snow, the low collective pulse of 7 engines at idle, the sound of the club existing in the cold and the dark and waiting for whatever came next. Dutch appeared at his shoulder. "He's gone. For now," Cade said. "You think he comes back?" Cade thought about a man who had changed his name and built a 14-month operation in a specific city because of a specific person and had walked out of a warehouse because the math had turned against him. He thought about what Carver had said about Whitmore, about thinking the report had been buried, about spending 6 years believing that. "No," he said, "not to Millhaven." He turned around and walked to his bike. "Cade." That was Trace, still on his phone, fingers moving. "The upload is confirmed on all 4 servers. I've been in contact with a federal tip line. Encrypted submission, no return address. They have the cargo documentation, the crate manifests, the financial records from Mason's Drive, and the Hargrove video." He paused. "I included the Whitmore transactions with a separate note identifying his current command position." Cade got on his bike. "How long before someone looks at it?" "At this hour. It sits in a queue. By morning, someone will have flagged it. By afternoon, if what we sent is what I think it is, someone will have escalated it." Trace put his phone away. "After that, it's out of our hands." "Good," Cade said. "That's where it belongs." He started the engine. The sound of it joined the others. That gathering of mechanical voices, deep and layered, each one slightly different, each one recognizable to anyone who'd spent enough time with these machines. And together they pulled away from the warehouse on the east side of Millhaven and rode back through the empty streets toward the garage. And the snow kept falling, and the city kept sleeping, and nothing about the surface of the night indicated that anything had happened in it at all. Underscore, 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 underscore. The garage was lit when they got back. Remy had the space heater running at full and had made a second pot of coffee that was not good coffee, but was hot and plentiful. And when Cade came through the side door, the first thing he heard was a child's voice from the back office, which meant Ellie had woken up. And the first thing he saw was Holt standing near the door with the specific expression of a young man who has been stationed somewhere quiet for 2 hours and is very relieved to see the people he was protecting come home. "Anything," Cade said. "Nothing," Holt said. "Street's been empty since you left. No vehicles, no foot traffic. One city plow went by about 40 minutes ago." Cade nodded. He pulled off his gloves and pushed his hair back and accepted the coffee Remy handed him without asking if he wanted it, which was the right instinct. He stood in the middle of the garage and drank it and let the warmth of the building reach him. And around him, the men who'd ridden to the warehouse were coming in and doing the same, the particular unwinding that happens when a situation resolves and the body begins releasing what it had been holding. Nobody said much. That was the specific quality of the Iron Wolves that outsiders consistently misread as coldness. It wasn't coldness. It was the understanding that some things don't need to be processed out loud, that the shared experience of a difficult night is its own complete communication, that men who've done something together don't require a debrief to know what they did. Dutch got his coffee and leaned against the workbench and looked at Cade across the room. Cade looked back. "Whitmore," Dutch said. "Just the name." "Yeah," Cade said. "What are you going to do about that?" "I already did it," Cade said. "It's on the server with the rest." Dutch considered that. "It's going to come back to you. When the federal investigation opens, they'll want to know how the information was gathered, who gathered it, what the chain of—" "I know," Cade said. "The club is going to be in that conversation." "I know that too." Dutch was quiet for a moment. His coffee cup was almost comically small in his hands. "You should have told us about Whitmore, before tonight, the Fort Drum thing." He said it without heat. It was not an accusation, not exactly. It was the statement of a man clarifying the terms of a trust. "Yes," Cade said. "I should have." Another quiet moment. "Okay," Dutch said. And that was the whole of it. No extended processing, no demand for more, just the acknowledgement of an honest answer and the decision to continue. That was Dutch. That had always been Dutch, which was why Cade had ridden with him for 11 years and would ride with him until one of them couldn't anymore. The back office door opened. Ellie came out first, still wrapped in the club hoodie, still holding the stuffed bear, her dark hair tangled from sleeping. She stopped in the doorway of the garage and looked around at the assembled men with wide, considering eyes. Not afraid, exactly, but doing the recalibration that children do when they wake up somewhere unfamiliar and have to reconstruct where they are and why. Then she spotted Dutch, who she apparently remembered from the parking lot, and something in her face settled. Rowan came out behind her, one hand on Ellie's shoulder. She'd tied her hair back at some point, and the lines of exhaustion in her face were visible in the garage light, but underneath them was something that hadn't been there before. Not relief? Not yet. Something earlier than relief. The beginning of a breath she'd been holding for months. She looked at Cade. He gave her a small nod. She read everything in it that was meant to be read. Nora appeared last, stepping around Rowan with the quiet efficiency of a child who had been waiting politely to be included in things that the adults kept handling. She looked at Cade and said, "Is it over?" He thought about how to answer that in a way that was both honest and appropriate for someone her age. "The dangerous part," he said. "Yes." She thought about that, apparently decided it was sufficient. "Okay," she said, and went to sit on the workbench next to Beck, who looked briefly startled and then moved over to give her room. Underscore, 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 underscore. At 2 a.m, Trace made 3 calls. The first was to a federal tip line, confirming receipt of the encrypted submission. The second was to a contact he had from his intelligence days. Not a friend, exactly, the word didn't quite fit, but a person who owed him a professional honesty and who he trusted to look at what he was sending and tell him whether it would be taken seriously or filed somewhere dark. The contact called back in 11 minutes and said 2 words. "It's serious." The third call was to a criminal defense attorney in Denver whose card Cade kept in the garage's lockbox, and who answered on the 4th ring with the irritated alertness of someone who had learned long ago that calls at 2 a.m. from this particular number were worth answering regardless of the hour. Cade spoke to the attorney for 6 minutes. He described the evening in the factual, sequential terms of a man who has thought about how to describe it and has chosen precision over drama. The attorney asked 4 questions. Cade answered them. The attorney said he'd be in Millhaven by 8 a.m. and to make sure everyone involved stayed available and said nothing to law enforcement until he arrived. After Cade hung up, Rowan was watching him from across the garage. Ellie had fallen asleep again, back on the couch in the office, apparently capable of sleeping through the kind of night that would keep most adults awake for a week, which said something about the specific resilience of children, the way they can find sleep as a refuge when the waking world becomes unnavigable. "An attorney," Rowan said. "For everyone," Cade said, "including you and Mason." Mason is in county. His arraignment is at 9. The attorney will be there. She looked at him for a moment. You don't know Mason. You don't owe him anything. He gave you the drive, Cade said. He didn't know what you'd do with it. He just needed it to exist somewhere outside his own hands. He paused. That's not nothing. Rowan was quiet. He was scared, Cade said. He made a catastrophic decision inside of that fear. That doesn't make the decision okay. But it means there's a version of what comes next where he gets the chance to do something with the fact that he was scared for the right reasons, even if he handled it wrong. She looked at him for a long time. The garage light was not flattering. It was fluorescent and unsparing, the kind of light that shows exactly what a face is. And what Cade saw in hers was someone who had been managing alone for so long that the presence of someone else managing alongside her was almost more disorienting than the night itself. I don't forgive him, she said. For the trunk. For Ellie. You don't have to. But Ellie, she stopped. Her jaw worked. Ellie asked me, when she woke up just now, she asked me if her dad was scared when he did it. Her voice had gone somewhere careful and internal. I didn't know what to say. What did you tell her? I told her yes. I told her sometimes people do terrible things because they're scared, and that doesn't make the terrible things okay, but it does make them... She paused. It makes them something you can understand. Eventually. Cade looked at his coffee cup. That's a good answer. It didn't feel like a good answer. Most good answers don't, not right away. She let out a breath that she'd probably been holding for the better part of 24 hours. It came out unsteady at the ends. She looked at the ceiling for a moment and then looked back at him. Thank you, she said. I don't know what else to say. I don't have a framework for this. You don't need one, he said. Underscore, 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 underscore. The federal investigators arrived in Millhaven at 11 a.m. on a gray Thursday morning, 2 days after the night at the warehouse. They came quietly, which was its own kind of signal, not the procedural theater of a visible operation, but the specific discretion of people who understood that the case they were building had connections in places that required careful handling. Trace's contact had been right. It was serious. The cargo manifest irregularities, cross-referenced with the financial records from Mason's drive and the stock numbers Trace had documented on the crates, constituted evidence of a diversion operation that had been running for nearly 2 years and had moved enough equipment through Carver Transit Solutions to make the dollar figures involved deeply uncomfortable for several people in several offices. Hargrove resigned from the city council at 9 a.m. on the same morning before the investigators arrived, through a statement that cited health reasons and contained the specific verbal architecture of a man whose attorney had advised him to say as little as possible while saying something. The statement was not convincing. General Whitmore was placed on administrative hold by his command at 2 p.m. The announcement was quiet enough that it didn't make national news immediately, which meant the people who needed to understand what it meant were the ones who understood it, and the general public would catch up later, which was how these things moved. Daniel Carver, Dennis Carvel, was located at a motel in Grand Junction 2 days after he left the warehouse. He went with the federal agents without incident, which surprised no one who understood him and surprised everyone who didn't. He had made, apparently, a series of calls in the 48 hours between the warehouse and the motel that the investigators found very useful. He had been, in the specific terminology of federal procedure, cooperative, which would matter later in the calibration of consequences. Cade gave his statement to the federal investigators with the Denver attorney present. He told the truth in the order the truth had happened, including the part about Fort Drum and the debrief, and Whitmore's name and the decision he'd made at 25 years old to let something go because someone with more authority had told him it wasn't his to carry. He told it without drama and without self-justification, and when the lead investigator, a woman in her 40s with the particular patient exhaustion of someone who has been working large cases for a long time, asked him why he'd held that information for 20 years, he said, "Because I was told it wasn't my problem. And then a child came through my door and showed me it was." She looked at him for a moment. The club's cooperation is noted, she said. That's all I need, he said. Underscore, 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 underscore. Mason Grady's arraignment produced a bail amount that Cade paid through a third party without telling anyone he was doing it, including Rowan, and which he would have denied if asked and never mentioned again. The criminal charges, custodial interference, child endangerment, were not dismissed. They were real, and they would proceed, and Mason would answer for them. But the context in which they proceeded had changed considerably from what it would have been 24 hours earlier, and Mason's attorney, the Denver attorney, now representing Mason as well at Cade's arraignment, was able to present to the court a picture of a man who had been under sustained coercive pressure from a criminal operation and who had made a devastating decision while acting from fear for his child's safety. It was not a clean picture. There was no version of what Mason had done that came out clean. But it was a true picture, and truth, in a courtroom with the right attorney and enough documentary evidence, carries its own weight. Mason was released on bail on a Thursday morning, and he stood on the courthouse steps in his yellow work jacket and the cold air, and he looked like a man who had driven off a cliff and survived the landing and was standing on the ground wondering what to do with the fact of his continued existence. Beck was the one Cade sent to pick him up. Beck, specifically, because Beck was the youngest and the least frightening and had the quality of honesty that Mason needed more than comfort right now. Beck pulled up to the courthouse steps on his bike and looked at Mason Grady and said, "You want to ride?" Mason looked at the bike, at Beck, at the street. "Where to?" he said. "Garage," Beck said. "There's coffee, and some things to talk about. Underscore, 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 underscore. The conversation between Mason and Rowan happened in the back office of the Iron Wolves garage on a Friday afternoon, 10 days after the night at the warehouse, with Ellie at school and Nora at school, and the garage running its normal operations in the main space and the door to the back office closed. Cade didn't hear what was said. He was at the workbench with Dutch, working on a transmission that had nothing to do with any of this and everything to do with keeping his hands occupied, and the sounds from the back office were muffled and indistinct. At one point he heard a voice rise. He couldn't tell whose, and then quiet again. At another point there was a silence that lasted long enough to be its own kind of communication. When Rowan came out, she went to the coffee maker in the corner and poured a cup and stood there with it for a moment with her back to the room. Cade watched her from the corner of his eye without appearing to watch, the peripheral attention of a man who has learned to read the shape of a situation without staring at it. Her shoulders were high and then they weren't. That was all. Just the visible release of something she'd been holding in her spine. She turned around and looked at Cade. "He wants to see Ellie," she said. "I told him I'd think about it." "Okay," Cade said. "I'm not ready to say yes." "Okay, but I'm not," she paused. "I'm not saying no permanently. I'm saying not yet." "That's fair," Cade said. She looked at him with the direct, undecorated quality that was the most consistent thing about her. "Is it? Is that fair? Or is that me still being angry?" "Can it be both?" he said. She thought about that. Something in her face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. The facial motion that comes before a smile in people who have forgotten that they're allowed to have them. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it can." Mason came out of the back office a few minutes later. He looked like someone who had just finished a conversation that required everything he had. He stood in the doorway between the office and the main garage and looked at the space, the bikes in various states of repair, the tools on pegboards, the men working, the fluorescent lights and the space heater and the smell of oil and coffee that was the permanent atmosphere of the place. Cade looked at him. "There's work here if you want it," Cade said. "Paid. Nothing off book. You show up, you do the job, you go home." Mason looked at him. "Why?" "Because you can fix things," Cade said. "Heating, cooling, mechanical. We need someone who can do that and who isn't going to ask questions about the membership roster." I put my daughter in a trunk. I know. That doesn't bother you. It bothers me considerably, Cade said. You still need work and we still need someone who can fix things. Both of those are true at the same time, he held Mason's gaze. You don't get the benefit of the doubt here. You earn whatever you get, but the option exists. Mason looked at the garage for a long moment, at the bikes, at Dutch, who was watching him with the flat neutrality of a man who had decided to wait and see and had made his peace with waiting. At Beck, who had driven him here and who looked back at him with the uncomplicated directness of someone who doesn't carry extra weight in his judgments. I'll think about it, Mason said. That's all I'm asking, Cade said. Underscore, 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 underscore. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning that had the particular quality of a winter day that is considering becoming something else, the cold still present, but the light changed, the angle of it different, the suggestion of a season not yet arrived, Ellie came to the garage with her mother. She came because Nora came, and Nora came because Nora had apparently decided that the Iron Wolves garage was a place she was welcome, a decision she had made unilaterally and that no one had challenged because it was difficult to challenge and because she was the kind of person who occupied a space with such natural ease that arguing her presence felt like arguing with weather. Ellie was different from the child in the trunk. Not dramatically, not in ways visible to a stranger, but visible to anyone who'd seen her in the parking lot. A 10-year-old still working out what had happened to her and whether the world was the shape she'd thought it was. She was quieter. She watched things more. She held her mother's hand more often than she probably had before, and sometimes in the middle of doing something ordinary, she would stop and look at nothing for a moment, and then return to what she'd been doing, which was the specific behavioral signature of a child whose nervous system was still occasionally checking to make sure it was no longer in danger. She was also drawing. She'd brought a sketchbook, which Cade hadn't known she had, and she sat in the corner of the garage on a folding chair and drew, while Nora did homework at the workbench, and Rowan drank coffee and watched her daughter with the sustained, quiet vigilance of a woman who was going to be watching for a long time, and had accepted that and found a way to make peace with it. Cade was working on a carburetor. He had his back mostly to the room, and he was working and not watching, but he heard Ellie's voice behind him, small and specific. What's that part? He turned around. She was looking at what he was holding. Carburetor, he said. It mixes air and fuel. Engine needs both to run. She looked at it seriously. What happens if it breaks? Engine runs rough, or doesn't run at all. She nodded slowly, processing this with the gravity children bring to mechanical information when it's offered to them without condescension. Can you fix it? That's what I'm doing, he said. She watched him work for a few minutes. She was holding her sketchbook against her chest. Then she said without particular preamble, Nora says you came and got her that afternoon. Nora came and got us, Cade said. There's a difference. But you went. Yeah. She thought about that. The garage sounds continued around them. Wrench on metal, the space heater, the low sound of a radio someone had turned on in the back. Why do you help people, she said. You don't know them. He thought about the answer to that. He thought about what he could say to a 10-year-old that was true without being complicated, because the true answer was complicated, and the simple answer was also true, and the question was which one served her better right now. Because somebody should, he said, and we're here. She considered that for a moment. Then she opened her sketchbook and turned it toward him. She'd been drawing the garage. Not perfectly. The proportions were approximate. The perspective slightly wrong in the way children's drawings are slightly wrong, which is to say charmingly, in the way that suggests the drawer is more interested in what a thing means than in what it precisely looks like. There were the bikes along the wall. There was the workbench. There were the lights overhead. And there, in the middle of it, rendered in a child's pencil lines, were figures. Not detailed, not portraited, but present, occupying the space, belonging to it. She'd drawn all of them. Cade looked at the drawing for a moment. Can I keep this? He said. She looked at him with serious dark eyes. It's for you, she said. I was making it for you. He took it carefully. the way you take something that is more than the thing it appears to be. He set it on the workbench and weighted one corner with a wrench so it wouldn't curl, and he turned back to the carburetor, and Ellie went back to her sketchbook. And the garage continued around them with the sounds and smells and textures of a place where things that were broken got fixed. Underscore, 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 underscore. On Father's Day, 4 months after the night at the warehouse, Ellie and Mason sat in a diner 6 blocks from the garage. The visit was supervised. Rowan's term, the court's term, the term that meant there were conditions, and those conditions were real, and everyone understood them. But supervised didn't mean accompanied, not for this specific visit, and so Mason and Ellie sat in a booth by the window with the particular self-consciousness of two people who know each other well and are relearning the terms. Ellie had made him a card. She'd made it at the garage, actually, at the workbench, with Nora beside her, offering opinions on the color choices with the unsolicited confidence of a best friend, and she'd sealed it in an envelope and carried it in her backpack for 2 weeks before the visit. Mason opened it at the diner table. He opened it carefully, the way people open things they've been given by children, with the awareness that the giving matters as much as the content. Inside was a drawing, the same pencil-line style as the garage drawing, the same approximate proportions, the same interest in presence over precision. It showed 2 figures, one large, one small. They were standing next to each other. Between them, the larger figure's hand was extended downward, and the smaller figure's hand was extended upward, and they were connected. Underneath, in the careful printed letters of a 10-year-old who had learned to form them precisely, "I know you were scared." I was too. Maybe we can be less scared. Mason sat in the diner booth and looked at the card for a long time. The diner had the sound that diners have on Sunday mornings, coffee being poured, the specific ceramic percussion of plates, the low-layered voices of separate conversations running simultaneously, a child at a table across the room laughing at something. Through the window, the street was warm in a way that June streets are, the winter completely gone, the light at an angle that made ordinary things look considered. He set the card down. His hands were shaking slightly. He pressed them flat on the table. Ellie was watching him with those serious dark eyes that had watched him from inside a car trunk 4 months ago, that had watched him from across a parking lot in the snow, that had watched the world with the specific recalibrating attention of a child who has learned that the people she loves are capable of frightening her and has decided to love them anyway, which is the hardest form of love and the most real. "Thank you," Mason said. His voice came out rough at the edges. "You're welcome," Ellie said. She picked up her hot chocolate and drank some of it and looked out the window and then looked back at him. "Are you going to work at the garage?" "I think so, yes. Nora says Mr. Mercer fixed her bike once, when the chain broke." "He seems like someone who fixes things," Mason said. "Yeah." She looked at her hot chocolate. "He fixed ours too. Kind of." Mason looked at her. The morning light came through the diner window and fell across the table between them, across the card and the empty space where all the hard conversations they hadn't had yet were waiting with the patience of things that know they will eventually be had. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know I've said it. I need to keep saying it until it means something different." "I know," she said simply. The way children say things that adults spend years learning to say with that much directness. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, somewhere down the street, a motorcycle engine turned over, deep and resonant, the particular voice of a large displacement engine at low idle, the sound that meant someone was going somewhere or returning from somewhere, the sound of movement through the world. It came through the diner window faintly, and then it receded, and the diner sounds came back around it. Ellie looked up at the window when she heard it. Something in her face, not a smile exactly, not yet, but the shape that a face makes when it's remembering something it has decided is safe to remember. And then she looked back at her father and reached across the table and touched the back of his hand with 2 fingers, briefly. The lightest possible contact, less than a second. And then she withdrew her hand and picked up her hot chocolate again. Mason looked at the back of his hand where she'd touched it. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would have been equal to it. Underscore, 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 underscore. The drawing Ellie had made of the garage stayed on Cade's workbench. He moved it twice over the following months. Once when a job required the full surface. Once when it got splattered with brake fluid and he had to wipe the corner clean carefully with a dry cloth. But he always put it back in the same spot, weighted with the same wrench, the pencil lines slightly faded now from the light, the figures still present in the middle of the drawn space, still occupying it, still belonging to it. Dutch noticed it one morning and looked at it for a moment without saying anything. Then he picked up a wrench and went back to work, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Nora came to the garage after school on Tuesdays. Nobody had formally arranged this. It had simply become true through repetition, the way certain things become true, through presence and continuation and the absence of anyone deciding to stop them. She did homework at the workbench and asked questions about the bikes with a curiosity that was specific rather than general, the curiosity of someone actually interested in how things worked rather than just performing interest. Beck answered most of her questions because Beck was closest in age and had the patience for it, and because somewhere in the last several months he had quietly become someone different from the 26-year-old who'd asked inconvenient questions on a December night, someone who carried the weight of what he knew now with more grace and less noise. Rowan came sometimes. Not every week. She had night shifts and a life, and the process of rebuilding a life that had been under sustained pressure for 18 months, which was not a process that permitted a lot of optional engagements. But sometimes she came, and she drank coffee at the workbench and talked with whoever was there in the easy, unperformative way of someone who has stopped needing to assess whether a space is safe and has simply accepted that it is. One evening in late summer, Cade was closing up the garage, lights off section by section, rolling the big door down, the routine of it, the same sequence he'd done 1,000 nights. And he found himself standing at the workbench in the last light with Ellie's drawing in front of him. He looked at it for a long moment. He thought about Fort Drum and the debrief room and a decision he'd made at 25 to let something go. He thought about 12 years of building something clean over the place where he'd let it go, and about how the thing he'd buried had come back around through a chain of events that he could never have predicted, and that had led, with the specific indifference of the way the world connects things, to an 11-year-old girl standing in his garage doorway in a purple coat asking for help. He thought about what he'd said to Ellie when she'd asked why he helped people he didn't know. Because somebody should. And we're here. It was still true. It had always been true. The problem was that true things didn't always protect you from the cost of them, and the cost of this one had been real. The federal interviews, the ongoing investigation, the conversations with attorneys that were not finished and would not be finished for a while yet, the questions about the club that would follow from this, and that he would navigate the way he navigated everything, with the specific combination of stubbornness and caution that had kept the Iron Wolves functional and legal and intact for 12 years. The cost had been real. He'd paid it. He'd pay more of it before the accounting was done. He turned off the last light. Outside, the summer night was warm, and the street was quiet, and the neon sign of the bar across the way was reflected in the wet asphalt where someone had run a hose down the sidewalk. Down the block, a car moved through the intersection with its windows down, music coming out of it, something with a good beat, passing through and gone. Cade sat on his bike for a moment before starting it. He thought about the things that had been broken and the things that were being fixed, slowly, imperfectly, at the pace that real things fix at, not the pace of resolution, but the pace of continuation, one day following another, each one an increment, the accumulation of increments eventually becoming something that looks, from a certain distance, like change. He thought about a 10-year-old girl and her stuffed bear, and the way she'd touched the back of her father's hand across a diner table for less than a second. He started the engine. The sound of it filled the empty street, deep and familiar and present, the sound of something that worked the way it was supposed to, and he sat in it for a moment before pulling away, just sat in it and let it be what it was. The particular satisfaction of a machine that had been maintained and understood and would carry him where he needed to go. Then he pulled out of the lot and onto the street and rode into the warm summer night, and the garage sat behind him with its lights off and its door down, and Ellie's drawing on the workbench inside, waiting for morning the way all fixed things wait, quietly, without drama, in the ordinary dark.